Introduction. Close your eyes and take a slow breath. Tonight, you are not going anywhere urgent. There is nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to do, and no clock you need to watch. The world outside can wait. Right now, the only thing that exists is your breath, the quiet, and a story so vast and so old that by the time it ends, 8,000 years will have passed, though you may be asleep before the first 1,000. This is the story of a universe that hummed with crystalline light long before the first human ever looked up at the stars. It is the story of beings made of living gemstone, ancient, powerful, and yet, in many ways, more fragile than they ever allowed themselves to believe. It is the story of a small blue planet called Earth, of a war fought in its meadows and mountains, of a rose-colored gem who chose to love rather than obey, and of a half-human, half-gem boy who, thousands of years after all of it began, would somehow have to carry all of it alone. Let that settle over you like a blanket. You are safe, you are comfortable, and you have all the time in the world. Section 1. The Ancient Universe Gem Civilization, the Diamond Authority, and the Birth of Order. Soft ambient tone low hum, like the resonance inside a crystal cave. Long before the Earth was anything more than a cooling rock drifting through an indifferent solar system, there was Homeworld. Picture it, a planet unlike anything in our own corner of the galaxy, vast, geometric, covered in structures of impossible scale. Towers of translucent crystal catching starlight and refracting it into colors that human eyes might not even have names for. Spires that rose for miles. Platforms suspended in clouds of glittering mineral dust. Roads that stretched across entire continents, each one carved from a single vein of stone. And moving along those roads, through those towers, inside those cavernous halls, beings made entirely of light and gemstone. These are the gems. To understand them, you have to set aside almost everything you know about living creatures. Gems do not have bodies the way you or I have bodies. Their physical form, the shape you see, the arms and legs and face is a projection, a light construct generated by a small gemstone that rests somewhere on their body. That gem, that small crystalline core, is the actual seat of their consciousness, their identity, their soul. The physical form they project is a kind of clothing. A very solid, very real, incredibly durable form of clothing, but clothing nonetheless. If a gem is injured badly enough, their projected form dissolves, and they retreat into their gemstone to heal and regenerate. The gem is what matters. The gem is what they are. This means that gems are, in a certain sense, immortal. They do not age. They do not get sick. They do not tire. They do not die of natural causes. Left undisturbed, a gem could exist for millions of years, unchanged, their mind accumulating experience after experience across geological time. This is not a metaphor or a fantasy. This is simply the nature of their existence. Thousands of years pass, and a gem looks the same as she did when she first emerged from the earth. But that immortality comes with a structure built around it. Because when you have beings who can live forever, the question of purpose becomes not just philosophical but existential. What is a creature for, if not to grow old, change and make way for the next generation? How does a society function when its members never leave? The gems answered this question with a system. A rigid, unyielding, crystalline system that governed every aspect of their civilization, who each gem was, what they were for, where they belonged, and what they were never, ever allowed to become. This system was called the caste, and at the top of the caste stood 4 beings of incomprehensible power, known simply as the diamonds. Take a slow breath in, let it out. The story is just beginning. The Diamond Authority, as the ruling body came to be known, consisted of 4 diamonds: white, yellow, blue, and pink. Each one was enormous in a way that is genuinely difficult to describe. Not merely tall, but monumental. Where an ordinary gem might stand roughly human height, a diamond stood stories tall, their presence alone enough to fill a room with palpable gravitational authority. Their gemstones were larger than boulders. Their voices, when they chose to speak, resonated in the chest. They were, in every measurable way, the most powerful beings in gem civilization, and they had built that civilization around themselves. White Diamond was the oldest, and in many ways the most distant. She ruled from a towering white ship in a gleaming palace, and she concerned herself with the ideal, with perfection, with order, with the vision of what gem civilization ought to be. She was not cruel in the way a villain of lesser stories might be cruel. She was something more unsettling. She was certain, absolute in her conviction that she understood the correct way for the universe to be arranged, and patient in a way that only immortal beings can be patient. She had all the time in the cosmos, and she had spent most of it constructing a civilization in her image, a civilization where every gem knew her place, served her purpose, and did not deviate. Yellow Diamond was the tactician, the commander, the one who built and ran the engines of expansion. She was sharp in every sense of the word. Sharp features, sharp voice, sharp mind. She had little patience for sentiment and enormous capacity for logistics. Yellow oversaw the military, the resource extraction operations, the endless calculus of what planets to colonize and how to do it efficiently. She was not without feeling that would become clear later, and at great cost, but she had trained herself to set feeling aside in favor of function. She was, in the language of her civilization, exactly what she was supposed to be. Blue Diamond was the keeper of memory and grief. She was, of the four, the one most visibly connected to emotion, though emotion, in gem civilization, was not exactly celebrated. She was melancholy in a deep and ancient way, a sadness that seemed almost structural, as though it were built into the particular way her gemstone caught the light. She presided over matters of ceremony, of culture, of the preservation of gem history and tradition. She wept, sometimes, in ways that were visible to the gems around her, and those tears had a peculiar power. They could overwhelm the emotions of anyone nearby, a kind of involuntary empathic broadcast that turned her sorrow into a shared experience. She was the heart of the Diamond Authority, in the way that a bruise is a heart tender and full of ache. And then there was Pink Diamond. But pink comes later. Pink is the center of everything, and centers must be approached with care. Below the diamonds, the caste system unfolded in precise, interlocking layers. Different types of gems were created for different roles, and those roles were not suggestions, they were identities. A pearl was a servant and a status symbol, designed to attend to a more powerful gem, to carry things, to hold things, to stand prettily and obediently. A ruby was a soldier, small, interchangeable, assigned to guard duty and combat in large units, where no single ruby was expected to matter very much. An amethyst was a quartz soldier, larger and stronger than a ruby, made for more significant combat roles. A jasper was a warrior of considerable power and pride. A peridot was a technician and an engineer, valued for her intelligence and her precision with machinery. A lapis lazuli was a terraformer, a world shaper, capable of manipulating water on a planetary scale and used to prepare new worlds for colonization. A sapphire was a rare and precious thing, a future seer, blessed with a limited ability to perceive what was about to happen, and thus kept close to diamonds for their prophetic value. And every gem was made in a specific way. They were not born. They were not raised. They were grown. Deep in the crust of various planets, the crust of Homeworld most often, but also the crusts of worlds selected for colonization, gem technology was used to inject organic and mineral compounds into the rock, seeding embryonic gemstones that would draw on the planet's resources and slowly develop into full gems. These places were called kindergartens. The word has a gentle sound to it, but the process was not gentle in its implications. Growing gems in this way drained a planet of its life, its nutrients, its geological energy. A fully exploited gem colony was a hollow, dead world, all of its potential extracted and crystallized into soldiers and workers for the Diamond Authority. A newly formed gem called a newbie or an emergence would push out of the rock, fully formed, fully capable, already knowing what she was for. This is one of the most striking and quietly melancholy aspects of gem existence. They did not have childhoods. They did not learn who they were through experience and time. They emerged from the ground already assigned, already completed, already a pearl or a ruby or a jasper or a peridot, already oriented toward their purpose with the absolute certainty of design. Which meant that the question, "Who am I?" was not, in gem civilization, supposed to arise. The answer was always already provided. You are what your gem is. You are what you were made to be. The caste tells you. The Diamond Authority confirms it. The civilization enforces it. To ask that question sincerely, to genuinely not know what you were for, or worse, to suspect you might want to be something other than what you were made to be, that was not merely unusual. That was dangerous. That was the first step toward something gem civilization had no vocabulary for. That was the first step toward being a crystal gem. But we are not there yet. The rebellion is still thousands of years in the future. Right now, the gem civilization is in its long, stable, ancient Middle Age. It has been running for longer than human civilization has been able to conceive of civilization. It has spread across many worlds, stripped many planets, crystallized the energy of countless ecosystems into gemstones that march and serve and build and obey. It is by any measure enormously successful, and it is deeply, deeply sad. Not that anyone on Homeworld would have said so. Sadness, like uncertainty, like the question, who am I, was not a concept with a legitimate home in the gem worldview. What gems felt, and they did feel, regardless of what the system told them had to be expressed in the channels the culture allowed, or suppressed entirely, or translated into something that looked like devotion and purpose and pride. So the diamonds were worshipped, not in the religious sense exactly, but in the sense that their existence was the explanation for everything. Why do rubies guard? Because that is what rubies do for the diamonds. Why do pearls serve? Because serving is a pearl's highest expression. Why do peridots calculate and engineer? So that the diamond's colonies can grow. Every gem's purpose looped back to the diamonds at the center, and the diamonds, particularly white, had arranged things so that this loop felt not like a cage, but like a completion. This is the kind of system that lasts a very long time. Not because it is good, it is not good, and we will come to understand exactly how it is not good as the story unfolds, but because it is coherent. It answers every question before the question can be asked. It fills every silence before the silence can become longing. It is the kind of system that only breaks when something comes along that the system was never designed to handle. Something like love. Something like a rose-colored gem who looked at a small blue planet and felt something she could not name and could not let go of. But that is still to come. Right now, close your eyes a little more. Breathe. Let the image of Homeworld sit in your mind, those crystalline towers, those geometric roads, those millions of gems moving through their assigned lives with the calm of beings who have never been given permission to wonder. It is a beautiful image, in its way, cold and vast and precise and shimmering. And it is about to be changed forever by one small, pink, lonely diamond who was given a planet and found, to her own bewilderment, that she did not want to take it apart. Pause, soft ambient breath, low tone settling into silence. Before we move forward into that story, let us linger just a moment longer on what the gem civilization felt like from the inside, not from the perspective of a diamond, but from the perspective of an ordinary gem. Imagine you are a pearl. You have just emerged from the earth, not from a kindergarten exactly, since pearls are made in a more particular way and you open your eyes for the first time and you already know what you are. You know your name, your function, your place. You know that you are beautiful by design, that your purpose is to stand beside someone more important than yourself and reflect their glory, to carry their things and speak their words and be, in essence, an extension of their will rather than an expression of your own. And you also know because somehow, somewhere in the design of you, this knowledge was installed that this is a privilege, that being chosen as someone's pearl is an honor, that your purpose is not a limitation but a gift, and any pearl who understood her nature properly would feel nothing but satisfaction in performing it. Now imagine that somewhere, deep in the substrate of your crystalline mind, there is a voice very quiet, very patient, very uncertain of its own right to exist, that does not feel satisfied, that notices the wide and curious world around it and feels something that, if it had a name, might be called longing, that looks at the stars and wonders what they feel like from the inside, that watches other gems move through their assigned purposes and wonders what it would mean to move through a purpose she had chosen. That voice has no vocabulary in gem civilization. There are no stories about pearls who became explorers, no songs about rubies who painted, no history of any gem who successfully remade herself into something her gemstone had not ordained. The system does not allow for these stories, because the system knows correctly, from its own perspective, that if such stories existed, they would be contagious. So the voice stays quiet. It learns to translate itself into dedication, into the appearance of contentment, into a performance of purpose so complete that even the pearl herself sometimes cannot tell where the performance ends and the self begins. This is the interior weather of gem civilization. This is what 8,000 years of it has built. And somewhere, in a place called Earth, a pink diamond is about to look up at the sky and feel that same quiet voice for the first time. Soft exhale, music settling into something even slower. If you are still awake, breathe in slowly. Before we move on, take a moment to leave a comment, tell us where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. There is something quietly wonderful about the idea that people all over this planet are falling asleep to the same story at the same moment, in different beds, in different cities, under different patches of night sky. You are not alone in this. And if this kind of lore sleep content brings you peace, consider subscribing. It means the world, and it means more stories like this one will find their way to you. Now, let us go back to the beginning of Pink Diamond's story. Let us go back to before the Earth. Section 2. Pink Diamond, the youngest diamond. Her palace, and the garden at the end of existence. Low, dreaming tone, something like a lullaby heard through stone. Every family has a youngest. And in most families, the youngest occupies a particular kind of space, watched more carefully than the others, held to a different standard, alternately smothered and overlooked, expected to be smaller than she is, and then surprised when she keeps growing. The dynamics of being the youngest are ancient and universal, it turns out, even in a civilization made of immortal crystalline beings who have been running a galactic empire for millennia. Pink Diamond was the youngest of the four. She came into existence, and we do not know exactly when, only that it was long after white, yellow, and blue had already established themselves and their domains as a smaller diamond than the others. Physically smaller, which in diamond terms was itself a kind of statement. Diamonds grew over time, their forms expanding with their power and their age. White diamond was immense, a being of almost incomprehensible scale. Yellow and blue were enormous in their own right. Pink was large by the standards of most gems, but beside her sisters, she was diminutive. Younger, less fully realized, and her character matched that smallness. At first not in a negative way, but in the way that very young things are small and soft and full of a wondering that older things have learned to set aside. Pink Diamond was, in the accounts we can piece together from what came later, a creature of tremendous feeling. She was enthusiastic in a way that made the other diamonds uncomfortable. She was curious. She wanted things not in the abstract political way that yellow and white wanted things, but in the immediate, visceral, personal way of someone who had not yet learned to translate desire into strategy. She wanted her own planet. This was the thing Pink Diamond wanted more than anything else in her early existence. A colony to manage, a world to oversee, a domain of her own that would mark her as a full and equal member of the Diamond Authority. The other diamonds had their colonies. They had their courts and their gems and their ships and their territories. Pink had her rooms in Homeworld's palace and the company of a court assembled for her gems assigned to attend to her, to entertain her, to keep her occupied. She had a pearl of her own. She had status and privilege and safety. She did not have purpose, not the kind that felt real. And so she asked. She was young enough and earnest enough to simply ask which, in the Diamond Court, was itself somewhat unusual. The other diamonds did not generally ask. They decided, and the universe arranged itself accordingly. But Pink asked. She requested. She brought her case before White Diamond, and Yellow, and Blue, with the particular mix of hope and vulnerability that only the very young can sustain in the face of powerful and somewhat indifferent authority. For a long time, the answer was no. There were various reasons given. She was too young. She was not ready. Managing a colony required a steadiness and a distance that Pink had not yet developed. The other diamonds had earned their territories through eons of existence. Pink had existed for what amounted, in cosmic terms, to barely a moment. The subtext, which Pink felt even if she could not always articulate it, was something harder, that she was not taken entirely seriously, that her enthusiasm read, to her older sisters, as immaturity, that her feelings, her immediate and obvious and unguarded feelings, were evidence of a development not yet complete. In the meantime, something unusual was arranged for her. A garden, on a small asteroid, or perhaps a moon. The exact nature of the location shifts in the accounts. A garden was constructed for Pink Diamond. It was meant to be a gift, a consolation, a place for her to have something of her own while the diamonds deliberated over whether and when to give her a real colony. The garden was beautiful by gem standards. carefully geometric, crystalline structures rising from curated stone, paths and patterns, and a particular kind of aesthetic elegance that gem design favored. And to maintain it, to tend to it, to be a companion for Pink in this isolated and gentle place, a gem was assigned. Her name was Spinel. Spinel was a type of gem not often mentioned in the broader records of gem civilization. A jester, a playmate, a companion type, made for entertainment and comfort rather than for labor or combat. She was acrobatic and cheerful, with a physical flexibility that was almost liquid, her form stretching and bending in ways that most gems could not manage. She was, in personality, incandescent, bright and fast and warm and completely devoted to the task of making Pink Diamond laugh. And for a while, it worked. Pink Diamond and Spinel played in the garden. They ran along the crystal paths. Spinel performed her acrobatics, her pratfalls, her elastic comic shapes, and Pink Diamond laughed genuinely, openly, in the way she did everything. The garden was a small world, contained and quiet, and within it, something that resembled happiness existed. But Pink Diamond's desire for a real colony did not diminish. If anything, the garden reminded her of what she wanted: her own world, her own territory, her own chance to be real in the way the other diamonds were real. She could not stay in the garden forever. She was not a garden creature. She was a diamond, and she needed to be treated like one. The day came eventually when the other diamonds relented. They gave Pink Diamond a planet. They gave her Earth. Softer now, the tone of something about to change. Before we talk about what happened when Pink Diamond arrived on Earth, let us spend a moment imagining what that moment must have felt like for Spinel. Pink Diamond left the garden. She did not say goodbye, or rather, she told Spinel to stay, to wait, to remain in the garden while Pink went to her new colony, promising, perhaps, in the way that people promise things they do not fully intend to keep, that she would return, that this was not the end, that the garden was still hers, still theirs, and that the time apart would not be long. She did not return. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. And Spinel waited. She waited in the posture Pink had last seen her in, standing. Cheerful, ready, she did not move. She did not know she was allowed to move. She had been told to wait, and so she waited, with the absolute fidelity of a being who had been made for devotion and had nowhere else to direct it. 6,000 years would pass before Spinel learned the truth, that Pink Diamond was gone, not just away, gone. Transformed, in ways we will come to understand, into something entirely different, dead, in one sense. Though not in the way death usually works. But Spinel's story, as devastating and as quietly unbearable as it is, comes much later. For now, she is waiting in a garden. The story has moved on without her. The story has moved to Earth. Let us follow it there, but not quite yet. First, let us let the image of the garden sit. A small, crystalline place on a rock in space. Pathways and formations glittering under distant starlight. And a small jester gem, bright and elastic and full of a love that had nowhere to go. Standing in the position her diamond had left her in, waiting for someone who would not come for 6,000 years. If that image moves you, and it should, even gently, even through the drowsiness, hold on to it. It is one of the truest images in this entire story. It is what the Diamond Authority system produces at its most extreme. A being so thoroughly defined by her purpose, so completely oriented around a single person's need, that she cannot conceive of herself apart from that service. She does not move because moving would mean accepting that she had been abandoned, and that is a truth too large for any amount of waiting to make smaller. She waits, and the universe moves around her. Now let us go to Pink Diamond on the night she first saw Earth from orbit and felt something in her gemstone shift. Pink was young in cosmic terms, very young, and she had wanted this for so long that the reality of it must have felt almost unreal. A planet. Her planet. A world assigned to her by the Diamond Authority, marked on their charts as a future colony, awaiting her design. She would oversee the planning. She would direct the kindergartens. She would watch the gems grow from the earth and march in her name. She would be real in the way her sisters were real. She descended toward the atmosphere of this small blue world with all of this ahead of her, and then she saw what was on it. Life. Not in the abstract geological sense, not as a resource measurement, but in the immediate, overwhelming sensory sense. Life everywhere in the oceans and on the land and in the air. Movement and variety and sound and color beyond anything the crystal architecture of Homeworld had prepared her for. Forests so dense the canopy was like a second ground. Oceans deep enough to lose entire mountains in. Creatures of hundreds of thousands of different shapes, each one a variation on the theme of being alive, each one going about its particular small existence with an urgency that somehow, from orbit, communicated itself even to a diamond. This planet was full in the way that Homeworld was not. Full in the way that colonized worlds were never full because colonized worlds had been drained, stripped, extracted, their fullness turned into gems and shipped away. Earth had not been touched yet. Earth was complete in itself. And standing on the bridge of her ship looking down at it, Pink Diamond felt something that the Diamond Authority had never prepared her to feel. She did not want to take it apart. This is the seed of everything. This single moment, this single feeling in a single diamond's gemstone, is the origin of a conflict that would last thousands of years and echo across the rest of this story in ways impossible to fully trace. A gem who did not want to do what gems were supposed to do. A diamond who looked at her assigned purpose and felt something that would not obey. She told her sisters. She reported back, earnestly and honestly, as she always did everything. She told Yellow and Blue and White that this planet was different, that it was full of life, that stripping it for a colony would destroy something that could not be replaced. She asked again. She asked if perhaps Earth could be left alone, if perhaps the colony could be established elsewhere, and the diamonds said no. Yellow, practical and cutting as always, pointed out that Earth had already been selected, the calculations already run, the investment of planning already made. Sentiment about organic life was not a legitimate reason to change a colony assignment. Life was not gems. Life did not matter in the way gems mattered. The colony would proceed. Blue was gentler, perhaps, but no less firm. This was not a question of what Pink wanted. It was a question of what the Diamond Authority had decided. And the Diamond Authority had decided. White said nothing that we know of at this point. White rarely needed to say anything. Her silence was itself a form of pressure. Pink was alone with her feeling and her planet. And so she began, slowly, quietly, and with an ingenuity that no one had expected from the youngest diamond, to find another way. The music drops even softer, just breath and hum. She walked on the planet. This was unusual. Diamonds did not typically walk among the life of a world being colonized. They managed from above, from ships, from command structures. But Pink Diamond walked on Earth. She moved through the forests. She stood on the beaches. She let the wind move around her form in a way that Homeworld's sealed and climate-controlled environments never allowed. And she met the life that lived there. Not in any formal sense, the creatures of Earth could not understand her any more than she could speak to them. But she observed them. She watched how they moved, how they interacted, how they communicated in their various ways. She noticed the particularity of each creature, the specific shape of each tree, the individual patterns of each animal. She noticed that life on Earth was not standardized. It was the opposite of standardized. It was wildly, riotously individual, each living thing a variation unique to itself. This was the opposite of Homeworld. On Homeworld, each gem of a given type was essentially the same as every other gem of that type. Same purpose, same role, same essential identity. The variation that life on Earth wore like a celebration was something gem civilization had systemically excluded. And Pink Diamond, walking through forests that had never seen a gem before, was encountering for the first time the full, strange beauty of individual existence. It was changing her. The planet was changing her. Something in her, in the very chemistry of her gemstone, it would later turn out was responding to Earth in a way that had no precedent in gem history. She was beginning to care, not just about the planet in the abstract, but about the specific, irreplaceable lives on it, each one. The particular bird that sang from a particular branch, the particular fish in the particular river, they were not resources. They were not background. They were themselves. And she could not destroy that. She would not. But she had been given Earth, and the Diamond Authority expected a colony. The solution she found, the one she developed in secret, slowly, over the early years of her time on Earth, was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of gem civilization. She decided to pretend. She decided to pretend that rose quartz was a different gem. A pause long, gentle. the kind that lets the mind breathe. We will come to the full story of rose quartz in the next section. The transformation, the identity, the meaning of what pink diamond chose to become. But for now, rest with this image. A young diamond, newly arrived on a living world, feeling something her civilization had no name for, standing on a beach at the edge of an ocean that stretched further than she could see, and deciding quietly, in the deepest private space of her own gemstone, that she would rather become someone else than destroy what she was looking at. It is an enormous decision. It is perhaps the most enormous decision anyone in this story makes, because its consequences reach forward across thousands of years and arrive, eventually, in the form of a half-human boy with curly hair and a pink star on his shirt, standing in the wreckage of an identity he never chose, and trying to understand what he is for. But that is much later. For now, the beach, the ocean, the wind, and a diamond deciding to change. Section 3. The Earth, a blue jewel, a colony, and a diamond who began to change. Ambient forest sounds, very low rain on leaves, distant water. Earth, in the time before the Gem War, was not so different from the Earth we know. Different in details, the continents had not yet arrived at their current positions. The coastlines were not the same. Some species that now exist had not yet evolved, and others that once thrived would not survive the coming millennia. But the essential character of the planet was the same. Warm, wet, turbulent with life, extraordinarily varied in its ecosystems, and possessed of a sky that changed every hour of every day, with clouds and light and weather that no architectural gem structure could have replicated or predicted. Pink Diamond, in the early period of her presence on Earth, moved through this world with a combination of wonder and grief. Wonder at what it was. Grief at what she knew was planned for it. The kindergartens had already been established or were being established in locations around the planet, those places where the rock composition was suitable for gem growth. The work of colonization had begun. Peridots and bismuths and other gem technicians were on the surface, drilling survey holes, running calculations, beginning the long preparatory work of extracting the planet's geological energy and turning it into new gems. Pink was technically overseeing all of this. She was the diamond in charge. These were her gems, this was her colony, and everything that happened here happened in her name. And she hated it. Not in the way that creatures hate things that hurt them. In the more complicated way that someone hates being the cause of something they know is wrong, when every social and structural pressure of their entire existence is telling them that it is right, and that to feel otherwise is a failure of understanding on their part. She tried again to tell her sisters. She went back to them this time, with more specificity, with details about the life she had observed, with arguments she had constructed carefully, trying to speak in the language of justification that the Diamond Court understood. This world is different. There are organisms here of a complexity and variety unprecedented in any world we have colonized. The life on this planet has value. And Yellow Diamond, patient in the way that people are patient when they are not really listening, explained again, value was a gem concept. Organic life was not gems. The colony would proceed. Pink's argument was dismissed. Again. So she went back to Earth, and she made a choice. She would not fight the Diamond Authority openly. She knew what open defiance would mean. A diamond could not simply refuse a decision of the other diamonds without enormous consequence. The structure of the entire civilization was built on the Authority's unity. A diamond who broke ranks did not just inconvenience the others. She threatened the entire architecture of meaning that the civilization had organized itself around. Pink was young and isolated, and she knew that if she simply said no, the other diamonds would simply find a way to proceed without her. She needed a different approach. She needed to protect the planet from inside the system, which meant she needed a disguise. She needed to become someone who could advocate for Earth without the Diamond Authority simply overriding her. Rose quartz was born in Pink Diamond's imagination first, and then in practice on the surface of Earth. The process was not simple, and we do not know all of its details, but what we know is this. Pink Diamond was capable, as diamonds are, of generating a wide range of physical forms. Her projected body could change. More than that, she could suppress aspects of her power, constrain her form, project something that looked like a different gem entirely, rather than a diamond. And she chose, for reasons that carry enormous meaning, the color of the stone she had come to love, the round softness of the form, the name that placed her among the quartz soldiers who would eventually be central to her rebellion to become Rose Quartz. A tall, powerful pink-skinned gem with a flowing pink-white mane of curly hair and a rose-pink gemstone set in her abdomen. Not a diamond's gem on the palm of the hand or the forehead or the chest, an abdominal gem, something different, something that suggested origin in a kindergarten rather than in whatever ineffable process created diamonds. A quartz, strong soldier class, respected but not elevated. Someone who could walk among other gems and speak and be heard without the conversation immediately escalating to diamond politics. Rose Quartz could talk to gems. Pink Diamond could only issue commands. And Rose Quartz wanted to tell the gems of Earth something very specific. The tone underneath deepens slightly, still gentle, but with more weight. She began to gather others around her. This was the work of years, patient, careful, dangerous work, done quietly while the colonization of Earth continued around it. Rose Quartz Pink Diamond and her chosen identity moved among the gems stationed on Earth and began to share the feeling she had been carrying since first orbit, not as a political argument, but as an experience. Come here. Look at this. Look at what this planet is. Look at what we are doing to it. It is difficult to overstate how radical this was. In Gem civilization, feelings about a colony world were simply not a category. You were assigned there. You did your work. You returned. The planet was a resource. The idea that a quartz-class soldier might feel grief over the destruction of organic life, might come to care about the well-being of creatures that were not gems, you might look at a forest being cleared for a kindergarten and feel something like loss. This was outside the framework entirely. It was not forbidden the way overt defiance was forbidden. It was simply unthinkable. Rose Quartz was making it thinkable. The first gem she gathered fully to her side was Pearl. This particular Pearl was not assigned to Pink Diamond in her diamond aspect. That Pearl of Pink Diamonds was a different figure, one who would have very particular roles in the larger drama to come. This Pearl, the one who would become the Crystal Gem Pearl, it is complicated because the exact origin of Pearl is one of the deliberately obscured parts of this history. What we know is that she became attached to Rose Quartz with an intensity that went far beyond what the Pearl serving a superior gem relationship was supposed to entail. Pearl did not merely serve Rose. She believed in her. She studied combat and developed techniques of her own volition, outside any gem assignment, because Rose needed fighters and Pearl wanted to be whatever Rose needed. She became, over time, one of the most formidable fighters in the developing rebellion, not because she was made for it, but because she chose it. This is enormously significant in a civilization where choice is not supposed to exist. Pearl chose. And she chose because Rose had given her a language for choosing, had shown her, simply by being someone who had made the most audacious choice imaginable, that gems did not have to be what they were made to be. Other gems found their way to Rose's circle over the early period. Some were drawn by the philosophy. Some were drawn by the experience of the planet itself. Earth, with its strange beauty, had a way of getting into a gem's sense of self and complicating it in ways that were hard to reverse. Some were drawn simply by Rose herself, by the magnetism of a being who radiated certainty and warmth and something that functioned like unconditional acceptance. A thing that no gem who had lived under the caste system had ever quite encountered before. Rose looked at you and seemed to see you. Not your gem type, not your assigned function, not your place in the hierarchy. You. Whatever was inside the gem, underneath the assignment. The thing that had never been given permission to speak. For a gem who had spent her entire existence being told that self was identical to function, this was nothing short of revolutionary. And then there was Bismuth. Bismuth was a construction-type gem, a builder, a smith, someone whose function within the gem military-industrial complex was to make things, structures, fortifications, weapons. She was large and colorful, her hair a natural iridescence of every color at once, her personality enormous, bold and passionate and funny and fierce. She was one of the first gems to join Rose's growing band of rebels, and one of the most committed. But Bismuth brought something complicated with her. She brought ideology. Where Rose's rebellion was, at its heart, an act of protection of the planet, of the life on it, of the right of every gem to be who she was. Beyond her assignment, Bismuth's vision was more aggressive, more specific. She believed that the way to end the Diamond Authority's oppression was to shatter the diamonds themselves. not just to protect Earth, not just to stop the colonization, but to destroy the power at the center of the system that made all of this possible. She believed, and she was not wrong, purely from a strategic standpoint, that as long as the diamonds lived, the rebellion could never fully succeed. They would always return. They would always have the power and the will to undo whatever the rebels managed to build. To this end, Bismuth began constructing a weapon she called the Breaking Point, a device capable of doing the thing that was supposed to be impossible, shattering a gem. Not any gem. Any gem could be shattered by conventional means in combat. The Breaking Point was designed to shatter diamonds, whose power made them effectively immune to conventional weapons. She brought this to Rose. She presented it with pride and conviction and the absolute certainty of someone who had thought deeply about what victory required. And Rose said no. This is one of the most significant moments in the early history of the rebellion, and one of the most contested. Rose refused the Breaking Point and refused Bismuth's philosophy with it. She would not shatter anyone, not a common gem, not a diamond. Shattering was permanent, was irreversible, was an ending rather than a change. Rose's rebellion was not about ending anyone. It was about changing the system, changing the future, making a world, maybe multiple worlds, where gems could be free in the way that the life on Earth was free, varied, and individual, and alive. Bismuth disagreed, profoundly and passionately disagreed. She believed that Rose was not being idealistic, she was being naive, that the diamonds would never stop, that they could not be reasoned with, that protecting life without removing the threat to it was a halfway measure that the diamonds would eventually overwhelm. The argument between Rose and Bismuth is one of the genuinely difficult ethical questions this story asks. Was Bismuth wrong? The rebellion did not, in fact, stop the diamonds. The diamonds did come back, again and again. The war lasted 5,000 years. And while we will come to the specific end of that argument, the devastating, heartbreaking specific end, it is worth sitting with the question first. Was Rose wrong to refuse? Was Bismuth wrong to insist? There is no clean answer. There is only the story, moving forward. A long, slow exhale in the ambient track, almost imperceptible. In the meantime, the Earth itself continued to do what it had been doing long before any gem arrived. It changed. Seasons moved across its surface. The ocean tides pulled back and returned. Forests grew and were cleared and grew again in different forms. And at a certain point, the exact timeline is unclear, but it was somewhere in the early period of the rebellion's formation, the organic life on Earth produced something new. Humans had not yet arrived in anything like their current form. The era of the early gem presence on Earth is set somewhere in the deep prehistoric past, far earlier than recorded human civilization. But life was advancing. Complexity was increasing. The great process of evolution that had been running on Earth since its formation was moving steadily, with its characteristic lack of hurry, toward greater and greater novelty. Rose saw this too. She saw the living world of Earth not as a static thing to be preserved, but as a moving, developing, self-creating system that was heading somewhere. She did not know where, no one could have known, but the direction of it, the momentum of it, was something she found extraordinary. She fell in love with Earth the way you fall in love with something that you cannot fully understand but cannot stop watching. And she made a promise not to any gem, not in any formal ceremony, but to the planet itself, in her own private way, that she would protect it. Whatever it cost, whatever she had to become, whatever she had to give up. The colonization was still ongoing. The kindergartens were active. The Diamond Authority's plan for Earth was proceeding on its original timeline. Pink Diamond's objections noted and dismissed. And Rose Quartz, this identity that Pink Diamond had constructed in her attempt to find a different path, was gathering fighters and believers in the forests and coastlines of a world that did not know how much was about to happen to it. The spark was lit, the fire was coming, and before the fire there was one more gem whose story needed to begin: a tiny red soldier and a serene blue future seer, standing in a moment that was about to go entirely and beautifully wrong. Section 4. The Answer: How Ruby and Sapphire Met, and Garnet Was Born. Very soft tone, the kind of music that feels like holding something delicate. Some stories, when you hear them for the first time, feel like they were always supposed to exist, like they arrived complete, needing nothing added and nothing removed, already in the exact shape they needed to be in. The story of how Ruby and Sapphire met and what happened when they did is one of those stories. It is a love story. It is also a story about disobedience, about surprise, about the moment when two entirely different beings look at each other and realize, without any language for it, that something has changed. That they have changed. That the world they are standing in is not quite the world they were standing in a moment ago. It is the story of Garnet, and it begins with an assignment. Sapphire was a gem of considerable rarity and value within the Diamond Authority's structure. She was, as all sapphires were, a future seer, a being with the ability to perceive, with substantial accuracy, what was about to happen. Not the far future, not decades or centuries ahead, but the near future, the immediate unfolding of events, the shape of what was about to occur in the next moments, minutes, hours. This made sapphires extraordinarily useful to diamonds, who kept them close as advisors and used their ability to navigate situations before they fully developed. This particular sapphire was assigned to Blue Diamond. She was calm, soft-spoken, graceful in the way of someone who has known what is coming before it arrives and has had time to compose herself around it. She had, as part of her guard, a small unit of rubies, 3 of them, the standard assignment for a gem of her status. Rubies were common, interchangeable, assigned in groups, because individually they were not considered particularly significant. They were soldiers, loyal, passionate, and straightforward in the way that people are straightforward when they have not been given many reasons to be otherwise. One of these rubies, the one who matters, the one who will become half of something unprecedented, was small, even by ruby standards, and her gem was set on her palm rather than the more conventional placement. She was eager and earnest and committed to her assignment with the particular intensity of someone who has been told all her life that she is one of the least significant types of gem and has decided, quietly and without fanfare, that she will be excellent at her job regardless. These two, the serene blue future seer and the small passionate soldier, were not supposed to become anything to each other. Sapphires and rubies did not become things to each other. The hierarchy was too wide between them, their types too different, their functions oriented in entirely opposite directions. Sapphire looked forward through time. Ruby charged forward through space. Sapphire contemplated. Ruby acted. They had nothing in common except proximity. And then the situation arrived that Sapphire had foreseen. Blue Diamond had sent Sapphire to witness and report on a confrontation with a small number of crystal gem rebels, the growing band of gems who had begun to gather around rose quartz on Earth. This was in the very early period of the rebellion, before it had grown into anything the Diamond Authority was taking seriously. Blue Diamond wanted information about these rebels, who they were, how many, what they intended. Sapphire had already seen what would happen. She had looked ahead through the veil of near-future vision and seen the outcome. The rebels would be captured. The crystal gems present would be taken. Their gemstones poofed or bubbled. The incident concluded efficiently. She had reported this to Blue Diamond. It was the kind of small, clean, satisfactory vision that sapphires were valued for. What she had not seen, what her future vision had failed to account for, was what one small ruby would do in the moment of actual confrontation. When the crystal gems rushed forward and the moment of violence arrived, Ruby, seeing that Sapphire was in direct danger, seeing that the outcome Sapphire had predicted was about to go wrong in a way that would put Sapphire in the path of harm, acted on instinct. She grabbed Sapphire. She pulled her close, shielding her with her own body, and they fused. A soft, ascending tone, something that rises and then settles into warmth. Fusion in gem civilization was a specific and controlled phenomenon. 2 or more gems of the same type could fuse multiple rubies into a larger, stronger ruby, for example, to create a more powerful form for combat purposes. This was understood, sanctioned, and used routinely. Fusion between gems of different types, however, was a different matter. It occurred you could not always prevent what happened in the heat of battle or close quarters, but it was considered deeply improper. The resulting gem was not a recognized type, not a member of the established hierarchy, an anomaly that the caste system had no place for. For gems of significantly different stations to fuse a ruby and a sapphire, for example, one of the lowest and one of the most valued, one barely acknowledged and one kept close to a diamond. This was not just unusual, this was alarming. This was a violation of the order of things in a way that the Diamond Authority could not simply categorize and file away. Ruby and Sapphire had never met before that moment. They had been in the same location, technically, but in the hierarchy of gem society, a ruby does not interact with a sapphire the way that proximity might suggest. They existed in different layers of the same space, and in the single second of Ruby's instinctive, unplanned, completely sincere act of protection, they fused. The gem that resulted was garnet. She existed for only a few moments before the shock of it. Rubies, sapphires, the surrounding gems broke the fusion apart. They separated, stunned. And what they experienced in those moments, what it felt like to be garnet, to be that fusion, to be two completely different beings, and somehow also a single unified presence, was not something either of them had the vocabulary for. Sapphire's future vision had not shown her this. This was the thing that had broken her careful, composed certainty about what was going to happen. The one thing she could not have predicted. The action of a being acting purely from feeling, with no calculation and no plan. Ruby had acted out of love. Not romantic love yet, they had barely met, but the pure, immediate love of someone who sees something precious being threatened and cannot bear to let it be hurt. That love, that pure impulse, had shattered Sapphire's vision of the future and created something neither of them had been prepared for. The fallout was immediate. Blue Diamond was furious in the specific cold way of someone whose carefully managed reality has been disrupted. The Ruby who had dared to fuse with a sapphire was to be punished. Normally, for gems of Ruby's type, this would mean dismantling a reset, essentially. Breaking the Ruby down and allowing her to regenerate in a form that did not remember this particular act of disorder. Sapphire made a choice. She grabbed Ruby. She used her future vision, the same vision that had been broken moments before, to navigate through the immediate chaos, and she fled. She took Ruby, the Ruby who had saved her, the Ruby who had done the completely irrational and completely sincere thing of shielding her with her own body, and she ran. They hid on Earth, in the forests and coastlines that were already becoming a refuge for other gems who had stepped outside the system. And in that hiding, they had time. They had time to talk, to exist near each other, to discover who the other actually was. Not Sapphire, not Ruby, the types, the assignments, the hierarchy, but Sapphire and Ruby, the specific, irreplaceable individual gems who happened to exist inside those designations. They found each other, and eventually carefully, with full understanding of what it meant, with the memory of what it had felt like fresh and vivid in both of them, they chose to fuse again, not accidentally, not under pressure, by choice, with intention, because they wanted to be Garnet, because being Garnet was the most true thing either of them had ever experienced. Garnet was a fusion of love, not convenience, not strategy, not combat necessity. Love, the first fusion of its kind in recorded gem history. They found their way to Rose Quartz, and Rose, who had been building her rebellion around the radical idea that gems were more than their assignments, who had been telling every gem who would listen that their existence had value beyond their function, looked at this fusion of a ruby and a sapphire, this thing the Diamond Authority called an abomination, this thing that had no place in the hierarchy and no name in the catalog, and she said, "You are welcome here." She said, "You are wonderful." She said, and this was perhaps the most important thing anyone had ever said to Garnet, the thing that Garnet would carry across thousands of years and would eventually tell a young half-human boy who needed to hear it about himself. What you are is the answer. Not to a question anyone else was asking, but to the question of whether love itself, expressed in the most literal way imaginable, as the fusion of two beings into one unified existence, could be valid, could be real, could be allowed to exist in a universe that had spent millennia insisting that every gem had a fixed nature and a fixed place and nothing outside of that. Garnet was love made visible, and Rose said, "Yes. You belong here." Long pause, just ambient tone, very low. Garnet became one of the most important gems in the Crystal Gem Rebellion. She was in many ways its heart, not because she was the most powerful, though she was enormously powerful, but because she was the proof. Every gem who looked at Garnet and understood what she was looking at saw the demonstration of what the rebellion was actually for. Not just protecting a planet, not just defying the Diamond Authority, but the right to be something new, the right to exist outside the assigned category, the right to be love, even if the system had decided love was not a valid type. She fought alongside Rose and Pearl through the thousands of years of conflict that followed. She was there at the earliest moments and the last. She carried the knowledge of what she was and what that meant through every battle and every loss, and every moment when it might have been easier to unfuse and simply survive as two separate, less conspicuous gems. She stayed fused. She chose, every day across those thousands of years, to remain Garnet, to remain love, to remain the answer. That is, quietly and without announcement, one of the bravest things in this entire story. Section 5. The Gem War. 5,000 years of battle across a beautiful world. Low, steady, ambient tone, something that feels like the passing of deep time. Wars in human history are measured in years, sometimes decades. The greatest, most devastating conflicts that humanity has recorded across its entire civilized span have lasted, at most, a few generations, long enough to reshape nations, to kill millions, to redraw maps and reset the course of history. But even the longest of them ends within a human lifetime. Even the longest of them is a thing that some people alive at its beginning are alive to see the end of. The Gem War lasted 5,000 years. Let that number sit in your chest for a moment. 5,000 years. It began at a time that, in human terms, corresponds to somewhere before the earliest written records of any civilization, before Sumerian cuneiform, before Egyptian hieroglyphs, before the construction of Stonehenge. It ended at a time that still precedes any recorded human history. The entire span of everything humanity has written down, every word of every language ever committed to any surface, does not fully encompass the length of the Gem War, and it was fought here, on this planet, in the landscapes that would eventually become the world you live in. The war did not begin with a declaration or a formal confrontation. It grew. It expanded from what was initially a small group of rebels protecting a single planet's life into something the Diamond Authority had to acknowledge as a genuine threat to their colonial project. More gems joined the Crystal Gems. Some came from Earth itself, quartz soldiers grown in the planet's kindergartens who looked at the world that had produced them and felt, as Pink Diamond had felt from orbit, that it deserved something better than to be stripped for resources. Some came from homeworld assignments on Earth who encountered rose quartz and found themselves changed by the encounter. The crystal gems grew in numbers. They grew in capability. Pearl, who had chosen combat rather than been born to it, became extraordinary, her techniques self-developed and therefore unpredictable, her dedication to the cause absolute. Bismuth forged weapons for the rebellion, her arms becoming any tool needed, her forge a place where the crystal gem's fighting capacity was constantly being expanded. Garnet fought with the particular ferocity of someone who has found what she is protecting and cannot be separated from it. And Rose Quartz, the gem who was secretly a diamond, who had given herself this new identity and invested it with everything she had fought with a shield that she could not have carried as Pink Diamond. The shield was powerful and unusual. Large rose pink, with a pattern of petals on its face, it could deflect almost any attack and could expand to protect others. But more than its physical properties, the shield was a statement. Where the Diamond Authority fought with weapons designed to shatter and destroy, Rose fought with something designed to protect. Everything about how she chose to engage in combat was an embodiment of her philosophy. She would not be the cause of permanent endings. She would shield, she would deflect, she would poof opposing gems, return them to their gemstones temporarily, but she would not shatter them. This was noticed. It was commented on. It was, in some ways, what made Rose Quartz's rebellion distinctive from previous, smaller acts of gem non-compliance. She was not just refusing the system. She was offering an alternative moral framework. She was demonstrating in every engagement that it was possible to resist without becoming what you were resisting. A subtle deepening of the ambient tone, as if the ground beneath the music has shifted. Homeworld's response to the growing rebellion escalated in stages. Initially, there was something close to dismissiveness. A quartz-class gem leading a band of defectors on a mid-priority colony world was not, in the Diamond Authority's accounting, a major crisis. There were gem compliance forces already on Earth. There were military assets that could be redirected. The rebellion would be suppressed. This is what Homeworld's military planners expected, in the confident tone of people who have never had a reason to expect otherwise. But the rebellion was not suppressed. It held. It pushed back. It won engagements it should not have won, using tactics that Homeworld's forces were not designed to counter. A gem army trained to fight by the hierarchical rules of the Diamond military where command structures mattered and formations were rigid, and the most powerful unit determined the outcome was not well equipped to fight a force that had abandoned those rules entirely. The Crystal Gems did not have a rigid hierarchy. They did not have a standard formation. They had Pearl's improvised and individually genius combat style, Garnet's sheer force and future touch, Bismuth's constant innovation, Rose's absolute commitment to her cause, and thousands of gem fighters who had chosen this. Choice made them different. You fight harder for what you have chosen than for what you have been assigned. This is true for humans, and, it turned out, for gems. Homeworld sent more forces. The Crystal Gems held. Homeworld sent better forces. The Crystal Gems adapted. The war, which was supposed to be a brief suppression operation, became a genuine conflict. And then, as years became decades, became centuries, became millennia, it became the defining fact of Earth's existence. The planet continued its life around and through the war. This is one of the stranger and more poignant aspects of the Gem War. It did not happen in a void. It happened on a living world that was moving through its own processes, seasons, cycling, ecosystems evolving, the slow geological time of the planet continuing underneath all of it. The Crystal Gems were fighting, in part, for the right of this life to continue. And it did continue, even in the midst of a 5,000-year conflict fought across its surface. But the conflict left marks. The kindergartens, active in the earlier period of the war, were a constant target for the Crystal Gems. They would disrupt the work there, delay the extraction process, attempt to preserve as much of the planet's geological energy as possible. The Homeworld forces guarded the kindergartens fiercely, because the kindergartens were the point. They were the reason Earth was a colony at all. If the Crystal Gems could prevent the kindergartens from completing their work, they could preserve the planet. The Beta Kindergarten, a second extraction site opened when the war made access to the original Prime Kindergarten difficult, was a place of rushed and compromised work. The gems grown there were produced under combat conditions, with insufficient time and depth, resulting in a generation of soldiers who were unusual in various ways. One of them was a Jasper who came out larger and more powerful than standard specifications, an extraordinary fighter who would become, thousands of years later, a significant figure in the story of Steven Universe. But that is far ahead. For now, the kindergartens represent the central tension of the war. Homeworld was trying to consume the planet, and the Crystal Gems were trying to prevent it. And between those two forces, Earth endured. Other things happened in those 5,000 years. Stories accumulated. Gems lived and fought and were poofed and regenerated and fought again. Some were shattered because Homeworld had no rose quartz morality about the permanence of ending, and they shattered Crystal Gems when they could. Some were lost in ways that were not death exactly, but were not survivable either. The war accumulated its costs, and through all of it, Rose maintained her philosophy. No shattering, no permanent endings. Even when it was costly, even when Crystal Gems were shattered by Homeworld forces and could never be restored. Even as the evidence mounted that her refusal to match Homeworld's tactics was allowing a war to continue, that a more willing commitment to violence might have ended faster, Bismuth had not been silenced yet in this period. Bismuth and Rose were still on the same side, still fighting together, still part of the same cause. But the argument between them, the deep, principled, unresolved argument about what victory required, ran underneath all of it like a fault line. Two gems who loved each other, who were fighting for the same future, who genuinely disagreed about the most fundamental question a war can ask: what are you willing to become to win? We know how that argument ended. We know what Rose chose, and what it cost, and what the cost of that cost turned out to be. But in those long middle centuries of the war, the argument was alive and ongoing, and the fault line was deep. Pause just the ambient tone for several long breaths. Somewhere in the middle years of the war, there was Lapis Lazuli. Lapis was a terraformer, a type of gem designed to reshape worlds using the immense power she had over water. On a planet with oceans as vast and deep as Earth's, this power was extraordinary, almost beyond measure. A lapis on Earth could theoretically manipulate the entire ocean system, could move tidal forces, create waves of incomprehensible scale, drain coastlines, reshape the water table. She was a Homeworld gem, sent to Earth on the authority of the Diamond Colony Project. But she was not a soldier. She was not there to fight the crystal gems. She was there for the terraforming work, the preparation and reshaping of the planet's water systems ahead of the colonization. She was caught in the war. Not in the way a soldier is caught, she was not a combatant, and the crystal gems knew it, but in the chaos of a conflict that had been running so long and across such distances that individual gems sometimes simply fell through the cracks of both sides' awareness. In a battle, in the confusion, Lapis was mistaken for an enemy and poofed by a crystal gem. And then, in the scramble of an ongoing conflict, where attention was always diverted and records were always incomplete, she was not returned to her gemstone to regenerate properly. Instead, she was trapped. Her gemstone was used as a mirror. This is one of the most quietly horrifying details in the entire Gem War narrative. A living gem, her consciousness intact, her awareness still present inside the gem, transformed into a decorative object, unable to regenerate, unable to speak, unable to do anything but exist in a state of compressed, helpless awareness while time moved forward without her. She was not shattered. She was not dead. She was simply there, trapped. For the entirety of the war's remaining duration, and then for thousands of years afterward, through all of the post-war centuries, right up to the present of Stephen's story. Thousands of years, silent, in the shape of a mirror, while the world changed around her without her. When she was finally freed by a young half-gem boy who trusted her intuitively and removed the corruption that had kept her suppressed, she emerged disoriented, grief-stricken, and furious in the way that only someone with thousands of years of accumulated pain can be furious. She was not a crystal gem. She had never chosen sides. She had been caught in a war that was not hers, punished for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and forgotten. The war accumulated its costs in many ways, not all of them visible, not all of them acknowledged. Lapis lazuli, the mirror on the wall of the Crystal Gem Temple, was one of them. Let us also speak of what the war was doing to pink diamond, to rose quartz in its long middle centuries. She was changing. She had been changing since she first arrived on Earth, but the change accelerated under the pressure of the war. She was living as rose quartz now, with a completeness and a continuity that was rewriting who she was. She had friends, not subjects, not subordinates, not gems assigned to her, but gems who had chosen her as she had chosen them. She had Pearl, who knew the truth, and who loved her with a dedication that went beyond assignment into something Pearl had also chosen. She had Garnet, who was a living example of the thing Rose was fighting for. She had Bismuth, whose passion matched hers even when their conclusions diverged. She had something that Pink Diamond, in her palace on Homeworld, had never had. She had an identity that felt real. And correspondingly, the identity of Pink Diamond was becoming less real, less present, more like a memory of a self she had worn before she found the one that fit. She was Rose Quartz. She had been Rose Quartz for longer, in lived experience, than she had been Pink Diamond. She had made friends as Rose, had fought as Rose, had shaped her entire moral and emotional architecture around the identity of Rose. The day was coming when the two identities would have to be resolved. When the war would reach a crisis point that required a decision more drastic than anything she had yet made. The day was coming when Rose Quartz would have to do something that Pink Diamond could not survive. Section 6. The faked, shattering Pink Diamond's secret, Pearl's burden, and the corrupting light. Very low ambient, the feeling of something enormous and irreversible approaching. There came a point in the Gem War when Rose Quartz understood something important and terrible. The rebellion could not win as long as the Diamond Authority believed that Pink Diamond was alive on Earth, managing her colony and fighting to suppress the crystal gems. The other diamonds would keep sending forces. They would keep redirecting resources toward Earth. They would keep treating this as a problem to be solved rather than a situation to be accepted, because Pink Diamond was their sister, the youngest, the one they had grown up alongside in whatever way diamonds grow up, and they would not abandon her to defeat. But if Pink Diamond were dead? If the Crystal Gem rebels had shattered Pink Diamond, done the most irreversible possible thing, ended one of the 4 rulers of the Diamond Authority, then everything would change. The diamonds would have to respond to shattering differently than to rebellion. A shattering was final. A shattering was a statement, and a shattering of a diamond might, just might, prompt the other diamonds to decide that Earth was not worth the cost. This was not Rose's hope. Exactly, Rose did not want the Diamond Authority to simply withdraw and leave Earth alone. She wanted fundamental change in how the gem civilization operated. But she understood that shattering was what the diamonds would understand. It was the language of irreversibility they recognized. It was the only thing that might make them act in a way that gave Earth a future. The problem, of course, was that rose quartz was pink diamond. Shattering herself was not possible in any literal sense. But appearing to be shattered, creating the convincing appearance of a diamond's death, that was a different question. She went to Pearl. A barely perceptible shift in the ambient tone, something held back. Of all the things in this story that are difficult to sit with, what Rose asked Pearl to do may be the most quietly devastating. Pearl was Rose's closest companion. Pearl was the one gem who knew the truth, who had always known, from the beginning, that rose quartz was pink diamond in a different form. Pearl's love for Rose was the deepest and oldest relationship in the rebellion, and it was a love that had been built on that secret. Pearl carried it with a completeness that required no reinforcement. She knew who Rose was, and she loved her, all of her, the diamond and the rebel and everything in between. What Rose asked was this. Pearl, who could shapeshift, could alter her projected form, as most gems could to some extent, would take the shape of rose quartz. Pearl would become the disguise. And in front of Homeworld forces, with witnesses who would carry the report back to the other diamonds, Pearl would appear to shatter Pink Diamond. It was a theater production, a single performance, staged for an audience that could not know it was staged, with consequences that would echo across the remaining centuries of the war and thousands of years of aftermath. Pearl would hold up a fake shard. Pearl would stand over the apparently shattered Pink Diamond. And Pink Diamond, who would actually be rose quartz, stepping back into her rebel identity as the victor of this confrontation, would survive. Pearl agreed. She agreed, as Pearl always agreed to things Rose asked, with the devotion of someone who had organized her entire existence around this one person and could not find the place in herself that might have said no. Whether she should have said no, whether Rose should have asked it of her in the first place, is one of those questions the story raises and leaves open. Pearl was not coerced. She was not commanded in any legal gem sense. She chose, but she chose in the context of a love so absolute that the word choice gets complicated. And Rose did give her a command, not in the moment, but afterward. After the performance was staged, after Homeworld's forces had witnessed it and carried the news back, after the faked shattering was complete and Pink Diamond was officially dead, Rose told Pearl, with the authority of a diamond, giving an order that Pearl's nature as a pearl would make her unable to disobey, that Pearl could never speak of this, that the truth of Pink Diamond being rose quartz, the truth of the faked shattering, must never be told. The compulsion was real and it lasted. It lasted through the rest of the war. It lasted through 5,000 years of aftermath. It lasted through the centuries of Pearl's existence on Earth after the war ended. It lasted right through the beginning of Steven's story, shaping everything he learned about his mother in a particular direction by specifically preventing the person who knew the most from being able to tell it. Pearl spent all of that time carrying the weight of a secret she had been commanded to keep, in a state of psychological distress that she could not fully explain to anyone who tried to help her, because explaining it would require saying the thing she was unable to say. This is the cost that does not show up in any accounting of the war. Not the gems shattered in battle, not the organic life destroyed in kindergartens, not the corrupted souls trapped in monstrous forms. Those are visible costs, enormous and real. Pearl's cost is interior, invisible. A permanent wound maintained by a command given in love by someone who did not stop to fully reckon with what she was asking. 3 long, slow breaths of ambient silence. The faked shattering worked. The other diamonds received the report. Pink Diamond had been shattered by a crystal gem rebellion on a mid-priority colony world. The youngest diamond was gone. The shard, the fake shard, the piece of pink crystal that was not and had never been Pink Diamond's gemstone, was presented as evidence. And the response of the 3 remaining diamonds was not strategic withdrawal. It was grief. Enormous, boundless, cosmically powerful grief. Yellow Diamond's grief was the kind that turns inward and becomes colder and harder and more efficient. She put her feelings somewhere she did not have to look at them and worked harder. She organized, she commanded. She directed the final stages of the military operations on Earth with a crisp ferocity that was underneath the expression of a loss she could not allow herself to feel. Blue Diamond's grief was the opposite. It poured out, uncontained, and turned into the particular form of sorrow that felt like devotion. She established memorials. She built what would become the Human Zoo, a collection of Earth's organic life, specifically humans, taken from the planet and kept in a preserved environment as a kind of monument to Pink Diamond's memory. Blue believed that Pink Diamond had loved the life on Earth, had valued it, had wanted to protect it. The zoo was Blue's interpretation of what preservation looked like, from a diamond's perspective: contained, managed, safe. It did not understand what life on Earth actually needed, but it came from real feeling. White Diamond's grief we can only infer. White does not speak of it. White does not speak of much. But something in the aftermath of Pink Diamond's apparent shattering caused White Diamond to retreat further into her ship, further into her philosophy of perfection, further away from the messy, painful reality of the gem civilization she nominally ran. Whatever White felt, she turned it into distance. And the distance became architecture, the vast, gleaming, silent architecture of a being who had decided that feeling was a flaw. The three diamonds convened over Earth. This much we know. They gathered above the planet in the final stage of their response to the shattering of their sister. And together, they screamed. This is what the show calls the corrupting light, but I want you to really feel what it was before I use that clinical term. Three beings of almost incomprehensible power, each one carrying a loss they were not equipped to process, each one expressing that loss outward in the most fundamental and involuntary way possible, a blast of combined diamond light directed at the planet that had taken their sister from them. Not a weapon, exactly. Not a calculated military strike. It was grief weaponized by power. It was three immortal beings in the worst moments of their lives, expressing something that had nowhere else to go. The light hit the surface of Earth and spread across it in every direction. Every gem on the planet at the time of the blast was caught in it. The light corrupted. It did not destroy, it was not death, which would have been, in a horrifying way, simpler. It transformed. The mental architecture of every gem it touched was fundamentally altered. Their consciousness was scrambled. Their sense of self, their memories, their ability to reason and communicate and recognize each other, all of it was stripped away, replaced by something feral and instinctive and in pain. They did not die. Their gems remained intact, their life force preserved. But the being that emerged from the gemstone was no longer the gem who had gone in. The forms they projected became monstrous, enormous, asymmetrical, driven by the same instincts and needs as their gem type, but without any of the context or consciousness that had made them individuals. They became what the crystal gems would eventually call corrupted gems. Creatures, effectively, who lived in a state of permanent confusion and distress, their true selves locked somewhere inside a gem that could not find the way back to the surface. Thousands of gems were corrupted in that single blast. Gems who had fought alongside rose quartz for centuries, who had given their existence to the rebellion, who had names and relationships and histories, they became monsters in an instant. And their monsters did not know who they had been. Rose had known it was coming. She had understood, from the combination of the diamond's rage and grief and the mounting military logic of the war's final days, that some kind of devastating response was possible. She raised her shield in the last possible moment, creating a hemisphere of pink protection around herself and the gems closest to her. Pearl was shielded, Garnet was shielded, Rose herself, of course, was shielded. But the shield only reached so far. It could only protect so much. And the crystal gems who were outside that radius, who were stationed elsewhere on the planet, fighting in other locations, too far from Rose to reach in the fraction of a moment available, were not protected. Rose stood at the center of a surviving circle of 4. The rest of the crystal gems, the ones she had led for 5,000 years, the ones she had promised she was fighting to protect, were gone, in the most terrible and incomplete sense of the word gone. The ambient tone drops to almost nothing, just the faintest breath of sound. After the corrupting blast, homeworld forces evacuated from Earth. They believed they had killed everyone. They had not. The corrupted gems were still there, still alive in their monstrous forms, still inhabiting the planet. But Homeworld did not know this. They withdrew, believing the blast had done what it was designed to do: end the presence of any gem on the surface of Earth. What they left behind was silence. The silence of a war that had just ended, without anyone declaring its ending. The silence of a planet that was still full of life, still turning through its days and nights, but now also full of something new. Thousands of corrupted gems moving through its landscapes like creatures, unable to find their way back to themselves, unable to call for help, unable to know that there might have been help to call for. And in that silence, 4 gems remained: rose, pearl, garnet, and somewhere underground, still growing, still too deep in the earth to have been exposed to the blast amethyst, a quartz soldier who would not emerge for another 500 years, who would come out of the ground into a changed world and not know what had happened while she was forming. These were the crystal gems who survived intact, these 4. Rose looked at what remained of everything she had built across 5,000 years of war, and she began the very long, very quiet work of going on. Section 7. The long silence post-war, Earth, amethyst, and millennia of carrying on. Ambient rain very light, settling, like something that has been going on a long time. The period after the war is one of the quietest stretches in this entire story. Not quiet in the way that peace is quiet, there was no peace. Not exactly. The corrupted gems were still present, still dangerous, still moving through Earth's landscapes in forms that had once been people. Rose and pearl and garnet were still on the surface, still managing what was left of an aftermath that had no clear endpoint. The planet was still turning, life was still living, but the grand scale of things had contracted. The war, for all its devastation, had had a shape to it, a narrative of struggle and purpose and the gradual movement toward an outcome. What came after did not have that shape. What came after was just continuation. Just surviving the morning and then surviving the afternoon and then surviving the next day, multiplied across centuries. Rose moved through this period differently than she had moved through the war. The war had given her a clear purpose: protect the planet, protect the crystal gems, hold against Homeworld. The aftermath gave her something harder: figure out what to do when the fighting is over, but the damage is not undone. The corrupted gems were the most pressing and most impossible part of that. She knew them. Many of them she had known for centuries. Gems who had fought beside her, who had been part of the rebellion from early years, who had names she knew and histories she had shared. Now they moved through the forests and coastlines as creatures enormous, in many cases, driven by the instincts of their gem type in the same way a dog is driven by its breed's instincts, but without the self-awareness that made those instincts a choice. They could be dangerous. They could be disoriented. They were, every one of them, suffering in a way that had no visible face to express it. Rose could not heal them. She had healing tears, the extraordinary power that her gemstone carried, the same power that would later revive Lion and transform Lars. But her healing tears were for wounds and regeneration, for physical damage, for the kind of harm that could be addressed by restoring a gem to a natural state. What corruption had done to these gems was not a wound in that sense. It was a fundamental disruption of the architectural connection between the gemstone and the consciousness inside it. Healing tears could not reach it. Not alone. The cure, she would eventually suspect, required something she could not provide by herself. All 4 diamond powers working together. The same 4 powers that had created the corruption would have to work in harmony to undo it. And the other diamonds were somewhere across the galaxy, believing the war on Earth was over, believing Pink Diamond was shattered, with absolutely no reason to return, which meant the corrupted gems could not be healed. Not yet. Not by Rose alone. Not in any foreseeable future. What she could do was catch them, bubble them, surround their gemstone in a protective sphere of energy that suspended their corrupted form and held them in stasis, not healed but not in active distress, preserved until something changed. This was what she did. Across the centuries, she and Pearl and Garnet moved through Earth's landscapes and found the corrupted gems and bubbled them and brought them to the Crystal Temple and stored them in the basement of a structure that grew and expanded around the lives lived within it. The Crystal Temple, the magical fused structure on the coast of what would eventually be called Beach City, was built by and for the crystal gems who remained. Not built in the sense of constructed by labor over a defined period of time, but built the way a home is built, accumulated, added to, shaped by the needs and personalities and specific absences of the people living in it. It was part gem, part organic, an architecture that followed no homeworld standards, that fit the crystal gems rather than any type-specific prescription. It had rooms accessed through a central chamber, each room a personal space shaped by the gem it belonged to, and underneath, the warp pad room and the basement where the bubbled corrupted gems floated in their stasis, waiting. Rose visited them. We believe this, though the show does not dwell on it. She went into that basement and she looked at the bubbled forms of the gems she had once known, and she felt whatever it is you feel when you are looking at the weight of what you were unable to prevent. The rain fades, just the ambient tone again, even lower than before. Amethyst emerged from the ground approximately 500 years after the war ended. She came out of the Prime Kindergarten, the original extraction site that Homeworld had established in the early days of the colonization, pushing through the surface of a cliff face in what is now the American Southwest. In a region already beginning to develop the dry, expansive character of the desert, she had been forming in the rock for longer than she should have been. The standard gestation period for a quartz soldier was something the records suggested was considerably shorter than what Amethyst's unusual depth had required. She was, in gem terminology, overcooked, left in the ground too long, emerging smaller and different from the standard specification for her type, in a way that the rigid Homeworld caste system would have categorized as a defect. She did not know any of this when she first crawled out of the rock. She knew almost nothing. She was newly formed, her mind a fresh installation in a young gem, her entire existence beginning at the moment she first opened her eyes on the surface of a world she had never seen. Unlike Homeworld gems, who emerged already knowing their function and their place, Amethyst emerged into a world where there was no one to tell her what she was for. The war was over. Homeworld was gone. The Diamond Authority had moved on. The world she found was Earth in one of its quieter millennia, and the only gems on the surface were 3 survivors of a conflict she had never known about because she had been underground for the entirety of it. Rose found her. Or possibly Rose went looking for her, having kept some count or record of the kindergarten's expected emergence timeline, knowing that there was a gem still forming in the earth even after all the rest had been corrupted. She and Pearl traveled to the kindergarten and met the small, confused, newly emerged Amethyst who had no idea where she was, or what any of this meant. And Rose, who had been living with grief and responsibility and the weight of a war's aftermath for 500 years, looked at this small lavender quartz who was innocent of everything and said something to her that would matter enormously. This is your home. You are free. You can be whatever you choose. Amethyst had no frame of reference for any of this. She could not know, in that first meeting, what it meant that Rose was offering her freedom when Homeworld would have offered assignment. She could not know that she was, by Homeworld standards, defective, and that Rose was choosing to say nothing about it, to simply accept her as she was. She could not know that the cheerful, rough, acrobatically playful personality she would develop across the next several thousand years was exactly the kind of free self-expression that gem civilization had systematically prevented from every other gem. What she knew in that first moment was that someone was glad she existed. That was enough to begin with. A soft shift, something warmer, entering the ambient tone. The centuries that followed are largely missing from the visible record of this story. This is one of the genuine mysteries of the Steven Universe timeline, the enormous span of post-war time during which Rose, Pearl, Garnet, and eventually Amethyst simply lived on Earth and managed the aftermath is almost entirely undocumented. We have fragments, we have implications, we have a few objects and one remarkable explorer's journal. An explorer named Buddy Budwick, a human, one of the first recurring humans in the fragments of history, the show uncovers encountered Rose in the desert sometime in what appears to be several centuries after the war's end. He was exploring and documenting the American West, and he found, in the desert landscape, a woman of extraordinary appearance living among a pride of lions, normal lions, desert lions, tawny and golden, moving through the dry grass with the specific grace of large cats. And among them, Rose Quartz, enormous, pink-haired, clearly not human, clearly aware that this human had found her, and apparently comfortable being found. She spoke with him. She showed him things. His journal records the encounter with the specific mix of wonder and matter-of-fact acceptance that characterizes the writing of someone who has seen extraordinary things and decided the most useful response is careful. Documentation. The lions in the journal illustrations are ordinary. None of them are pink. Lion, the magical, dimension-carrying, centuries-old creature who would eventually become Stephen's companion, had not yet become what he was at this point in the story, or perhaps had already become it and was not among the Desert Pride at that particular time. The journal's illustrations suggest a large group of lions, all normal, living alongside Rose in the open desert. What happened to those lions over the following centuries is one of the quieter, unanswered questions. They were ordinary creatures with ordinary lifespans. They grew old and died, as lions do. Rose lived on. She watched them go, one by one, the pride shrinking across generations, the individual animals she had known being replaced by their descendants who did not know her, who were simply desert lions with no knowledge of the gem in their territory. And then one lion died, and something in Rose could not let it go. She cried over him. Her tears fell on his gemstone, not a gem in the gem sense, but the ordinary gemstone of a mortal creature, and something in the extraordinary chemistry of diamond healing tears, something that worked differently on organic life than it worked on gem forms, brought him back. Pink, vast, magical, lion. He was not what he had been, but he was alive. He could walk on water. He could generate portals. He had a dimension inside his mane that Rose filled over the following years, with the things she was not ready to let go of, but could not carry openly: her sword, her rebellion flag, her memories of a self she had given up. And later, when Bismuth's story reached its devastating midpoint, Bismuth herself, Rose kept her most important things inside a lion she had brought back from death. If that is not a portrait of a being who loved deeply and grieved silently and carried everything alone, I do not know what is. A long pause, the ambient tone holds steady, settled. There is something worth understanding about what it means to live for thousands of years on a planet that is not your home, watching civilization after civilization develop among the beings you have vowed to protect, while carrying the weight of a secret that prevents you from being fully known by anyone except the one companion you have bound to silence. Pearl knew the truth. Pearl always knew. But Pearl had been commanded not to speak it, and the command shaped everything between them. Rose and Pearl could love each other, and they did, with a depth and duration that surpassed almost anything in the story, but they could not be entirely honest. The most fundamental fact of Rose's identity was off the table. Pearl could not ask, could not address, could not put into words the things she knew, and Rose knew she knew, and both of them lived around like a piece of furniture in the center of a room that they had both agreed never to directly acknowledge. This is what the thousands of post-war years looked like for Pearl. Loving someone completely, helping someone completely, existing alongside someone completely, and being unable to speak the single most important truth in her possession. Unable by command. Unable in a way that produced visible psychological distress whenever she came close to the boundary of what she was allowed to say. The relationship between Rose and Pearl in the post-war centuries was, by any measure, the central relationship in both their lives. They were each other's closest companion across millennia of an Earth that was always changing around them. They watched human civilizations rise and develop and fall and reform. There is a painting in an art museum visible in the background of one episode, quiet and easy to miss, that appears to show two women from the Renaissance period who are clearly Rose and Pearl, dressed in the clothes of the era, moving through human society in one of their many passes through human history. They were there for all of it. The long, slow transformation of the species they had vowed to protect, the development of language and art and science and music and every other expression of human ingenuity, unfolding across the centuries while the crystal gems persisted on their coastline, catching corrupted gems and storing them in the temple basement, and continuing the gentle, endless work of being guardians of a world they could never fully explain themselves to. And underneath all of it, growing slowly, beginning to form the shape of something Rose had been moving toward for thousands of years, was a question. She had given up being Pink Diamond. She had given up the identity, the authority, the place in the diamond structure. She had given up Homeworld. She had given up certainty and permanence and the cosmic scale of what a diamond's life was supposed to be. In exchange, she had gotten Earth. She had gotten the rebellion, the war, the aftermath. She had gotten Pearl and Garnet and Amethyst, her crystal gems, her family. She had gotten millennia of walking on a living planet and being changed by it. And she had gotten somewhere in the deep middle of those thousands of years, a feeling that she could not find a gem word for. She had been watching humans live, brief, bright, mortal, fully committed to their lives in the way that only beings who know their time is limited can be committed, and she had felt something in response. Something like admiration, and something like longing, and something like wonder at what it would mean to exist the way they existed. To be one person, one self, one life, complete and finite, rather than an immortal being who accumulated centuries like sediment. To be new, she had been thinking about it for a very long time. About what it would mean to stop being rose quartz and become something else entirely, not another identity, not another disguise, but a genuine giving over of her form and her gem into something that had never existed before, a child. A human child, half her own nature, and half something that had never been gem at all. Section 8. Greg Universe Avon, a guitar, and the human who loved a legend. Soft guitar tone in the ambient, just a hint of it. Acoustic, warm. Greg Universe did not look like someone who was going to change the history of an ancient alien civilization. He was young, in the way that humans are young, not the geological youth of a newly emerged gem, but the vivid, specific, slightly uncertain youth of a human in his 20s. He drove a van, he played guitar, and he played it well, and he believed with the earnest conviction of someone who has not yet learned that conviction and success are not the same thing, that his music would reach people. He performed wherever he could. He was not famous. He was not particularly successful by any conventional measure. He was a person trying to be something in a world that was not especially waiting for him. He pulled into Beach City on a normal day and set up for a small outdoor concert near the beach, and Rose Quartz came to watch. She did not know what she was walking into exactly. Or perhaps she did. Rose had lived long enough and learned human nature well enough to understand something about what drew her to watch a young man play guitar on a beach. She had been feeling her way towards something for a long time, some kind of change, some kind of new beginning. She had been watching humanity for thousands of years and had always felt something move in her when she watched them fully, wholeheartedly, committedly alive. Greg, playing his music for a nearly empty audience with the same sincerity he would have brought to a stadium, was that quality distilled. He noticed her watching. Of course, he noticed her rose was not inconspicuous in her size and her color and the quality of her attention when she gave it. He played to her. She stayed for the whole concert, and afterward they talked. The guitar tone grows slightly more present, still background, still quiet. What followed was a courtship that does not map onto any standard template. Rose was thousands of years old. Greg was in his 20s. Rose was not human. She was a being made of crystalline light and gemstone energy, projecting a physical form that was real but not biological in any sense that Greg's biology would recognize. Greg was entirely, wonderfully, completely human, warm-blooded and mortal, and full of feelings that he expressed in song and in conversation, and in the particular way that humans have of being present with each other when they choose to be. The improbability of what they were to each other is not lost on anyone in the story. Pearl found it baffling and painful, in the way that someone finds painful the discovery that the person you have organized your entire existence around is capable of loving something you are not. Garnet found it wonderful, in the specific way that someone who is a fusion of love understands when love is happening and appreciates it. Amethyst found it funny and real, and exactly the kind of chaotic, rule-breaking development that she had always appreciated about the life she had been allowed to choose. And Rose found in Greg something she had not found in 5,000 years of rebellion and war and aftermath and solitary immortal continuation. She found someone who knew nothing about her past. Greg did not know she was a diamond. He did not know she had led a war. He did not know about Pearl's compulsion, or the corrupted gems in the basement, or the faked shattering, or the thousands of years of accumulated consequence. He knew Rose Quartz, the gem who lived on the beach and was large and pink and beautiful, and who listened to him like he was the only thing worth listening to in the known universe. There is enormous freedom in being known by someone who does not know your history. It is not the same as being fully known. It cannot be, because the history is part of what you are, and a self built on a secret will always have that quality of incompleteness to it. But for Rose, who had spent thousands of years carrying everything alone and carrying even more after the command she had given Pearl, the experience of being with someone who simply saw her, without the weight of what she had been and done and failed to prevent was something she had not known she was capable of needing. She loved him. Genuinely, with the specific depth that comes not from a long history but from recognition, the feeling of seeing someone and understanding them in a way that bypasses explanation. And Greg loved her back. He loved her with the full, unguarded, sometimes bewildered love of a human who has found something extraordinary and cannot believe his luck. He wrote songs about it. Of course, he wrote songs about it. That was what Greg did with everything he felt. He put it in music. And the music was real and unironic and genuinely moving in the way that things made without defense are moving. They had years together. The show is not precise about how many, somewhere between one and several, human time, before the nature of what Rose was considering became clear. In those years, Greg tried to understand the gem world, with varying success. He met Pearl, who was cold to him in a way that was not cruelty but was unmistakably the expression of someone whose heart was breaking. He learned some of what the crystal gems were, what they had done, what they were still doing on Earth. He could not fully understand it. No single human life, with its built-in horizon of mortality, has the architecture to fully comprehend what thousands of years of experience feels like from the inside, but he tried. He listened. He asked questions and was not deterred by the many things Rose could not answer. He gave her something she had not known to want. He made her laugh. Not the polite, performative kind of response that Rose had, perhaps given to other things she found pleasant over the millennia, but genuine laughter, surprised, delighted, the kind that sneaks up on you. He found her funny and strange and magnificent, and he was not intimidated by her power or her history or the large, impossible scale of what she was, and the combination of those things was apparently irresistible to a being who had spent most of her existence being either worshipped or opposed, with very little in between. They were, in the plainest possible terms, happy. A longer pause, the guitar tone fades completely back into ambient hum. At some point in this happiness, we do not know exactly when or how the conversation went or what precipitated it. Rose told Greg what she was considering. She wanted to have a child. Not a biological child in the way that human reproduction works, not exactly. The mechanics of it for a gem were different. A gem could, under certain conditions, give up her physical form, dissolve the light construct of her body, surrender the energy that maintained it, and pour that energy into the creation of a new life. The gemstone would remain, passed to the new being along with all the power it contained. But the gem herself, the consciousness, the personality, the entity that had existed inside and through the gem would be gone. Not dead in the way that shattering is death, but dissolved into the new life. Present somehow, part of the new being at a cellular level, but no longer herself. She would stop existing as rose quartz to allow a new person to begin. Greg understood this better than one might expect, given that it had no analog in human experience. He understood it with the particular clarity of someone who loves a person completely and has still been thinking about death mortality, was a feature of Greg's existence in a way it was not Rose's, and he had been living alongside someone immortal long enough to have thought about what that meant. He understood what Rose was saying. He understood what it would cost. The show does not give us the full conversation. We have the outlines. Greg knew. Rose chose freely. And the decision was made with something that resembled mutual understanding even across the enormous gulf of their different natures. Whether Rose fully reckoned, in that conversation, with what it would mean for Steven to carry her legacy without her, that is harder to know. She made a videotape. She tried to leave him something. She said she loved him before she knew him, and that she was giving him everything she had. But she could not tell him about bismuth in the dimension. She could not tell him about the corrupted gems in the basement. She could not tell him about Pink Diamond. She could not tell him about the war or the scream or the faked shattering or Pearl's compulsion. She could not tell him any of it, because the tape she made was not long enough for all of it, and perhaps because she did not know how to be honest about all of it in a way that would help him rather than burden him before he had even begun, she left him a life. Just as the show says, in one of its more thoughtful moments, she left him not a destiny, but a life. Whether that was enough is the question the story spends most of its length asking. Greg was present when Steven was born, in whatever sense that word applies to an event unlike any human birth. He was there when rose quartz dissolved into light and her gemstone found its place in the child she had created, and the child who would be Steven Universe took his first breath, and the world shifted quietly on its axis in a way that no one who was not in that room would have any reason to notice. Steven Universe, Greg's last name, Rose's whole heart converted into something new. A half-gem, half-human boy with curly hair and his mother's gemstone in his stomach, lying in the arms of a guitar player who had loved a legend and now had a child to raise alone. The crystal gems were there too, standing in the back, looking at this new, impossible thing that they also had, somehow, to raise. Pearl in a state of complicated grief that she could not fully express, because the person she had loved the most was gone, and the thing that had replaced her was a baby, and the baby needed her, and Pearl has never in her entire existence been able to say no when she was needed. Garnet steady and present and already, in some intuitive way, understanding what Steven was going to require. Amethyst curious and already clearly fond. A family assembled around a half-human child in a house attached to a magical alien temple on a beach. And outside, the ocean, and the sun rising over it, and a new story beginning in the long wake of everything that had come before. Section 9. Steven growing up between two worlds. A gentle, slightly playful ambient tone warmer than the previous section's lighter. Steven Universe grew up the way children grow up, in pieces, one day at a time. Running down to the beach before breakfast and eating breakfast at noon and asking questions that did not have good answers and accepting, with the remarkable adaptability of children, the completely unusual terms of his existence. He lived in a small house attached to a large, magical alien temple. His guardians were an immortal fusion who wore a visor and never opened her eyes, a perfectionist swordsfighter with a star on her forehead and an accent that matched no particular country, and a boisterous purple shapeshifter who kept snacks behind a rock. His father lived in a van nearby, and his dad was the most normal person in his life. His neighborhood was a small seaside town where the residents had quietly normalized the presence of magical beings on the beach because several decades of unusual events had given them the emotional toolkit for it. He had a best friend named Connie, a thoughtful and determined girl with a passion for books and sword fighting, who would become one of the most significant people in his life. He had a lion, large, pink, magical, who appeared one day and chose Steven the way cats choose people, with a specificity that suggested this was less random than it appeared. He had a mother who had stopped existing before he was born, and whose presence was everywhere in the world he lived in, and nowhere in his actual life. He was, in most visible ways, a happy child. This is important. The story that unfolds is not a story of childhood suffering, not a tragedy about a boy robbed of a good life. Steven had a good life. He was loved actively, specifically, by people who showed up for him in every way they knew how. He loved his town and his neighbors and his dad and his crystal gems and the ocean outside his window and the donuts from the bakery and the music Greg played. He approached the world with a warmth that was both his own and somehow also Rose's, the same quality of attention, the same depth of engagement, manifesting in a form that was entirely new. But underneath the warmth and underneath the happiness and underneath the genuine fullness of his life, there was the weight. He carried his mother's gemstone. He had her powers, though they arrived slowly and unpredictably, appearing in moments of need without always cooperating in moments of practice. He had her history, all of it, waiting somewhere ahead of him to be discovered in pieces. He had the crystal gems, who loved him but who had loved her first and whose relationship with him was always, in some way they could not entirely prevent, filtered through that. He had a world that kept asking him to be the son of Rose Quartz before it asked him to simply be himself. He did not know yet how much of that history was still to come. The ambient tone stays warm but slows slightly. His powers emerged gradually, and they were strange in ways that no gem could fully predict. The shield came first. In moments of crisis, the same rose-pink shield Rose had carried, summoned by need rather than training, arriving when Steven was in danger before he had any understanding of how to call it. This was recognizable, at least. The crystal gems knew the shield. They had fought alongside it for thousands of years. Seeing it emerge from Steven's gemstone was something they could locate in their understanding of the world. The healing tears were next. Discovered almost by accident, Steven cried over something he cared about, and the tears turned out to have the restorative power that Rose's tears had always carried. He used them, over the course of the story, to revive Lars from death and to partially restore the consciousness of corrupted gems when nothing else could reach them. The bubbles, the protective spheres of energy he could generate, allowed him to preserve things and people, and was connected to the same technique Rose had used to bubble the corrupted gems in the temple basement for thousands of years. The plant growth Strange, briefly mentioned, largely unexplored, seemed to connect his gemstone energy to the organic life of Earth in a way that the other crystal gems could not do. He could fuse with humans. This should not have been possible. Gem fusion was a gem phenomenon, requiring the specific resonance of two gem energies finding harmony with each other. Humans did not have gem energy, but Steven did, and Steven was also human, and the double nature of his existence meant he could bridge between those worlds in ways that redefined what fusion meant in practice. He could project his consciousness into dreams, into the minds of sleeping gems, into whatever mental space an entity had that was accessible to his particular quality of empathy and psychic reach. Each ability arrived on its own timeline, in its own context, connected to emotional moments more than to training milestones. This was different from how gem powers typically developed. Gems emerged knowing what they could do, their abilities built in from formation. Steven had to discover himself, one power at a time, through the experiences of his life. This was, of course, exactly what Rose had intended. She had wanted him to live into himself rather than inherit himself. She had wanted him to be, in the most complete sense, his own person, shaped by experience and choice rather than by crystalline design. Whether this was generous or avoidant on her part is the question that the story takes a long time to arrive at. It is probably both. The revelations came slowly at first and then all at once. The bubble with bismuth. The crystal gem who had been inside Lion's dimension for thousands of years, sealed there by Rose after their argument about the breaking point, listed in the crystal gem records as having gone missing in battle. Bismuth emerged from the bubble when Steven accidentally released her, warm and funny and full of the passionate fire that had made her central to the rebellion. And then as the truth of why she had been sealed came out, the encounter became the hardest thing Steven had faced to that point. Bismuth was not wrong. She had simply disagreed in the wrong direction with the most powerful person in the rebellion, and Rose's response had been to erase her from the story, to make her convenient absence permanent, to lie to the crystal gems about it. The idealistic, loving, protect-all-life Rose Quartz had, when faced with a genuine challenge to her authority and her philosophy, done the thing that powerful people do. She had removed the challenge and reported it as something else. Steven could not defend this. He could understand it, could find the emotional logic in it, could see the person Rose had been and what she must have been feeling. But understanding was not the same as defending, and the defense would have required saying that Rose had been right to seal Bismuth away for millennia, rather than simply disagreeing openly and letting Bismuth make her own choices. She had not been right. And Steven knew it, even though knowing it complicated the mother he had spent his whole life trying to love from a distance. Then the trial on Homeworld. Steven, having been captured by Homeworld forces who believed he was Rose Quartz who had shattered Pink Diamond, found himself in a formal gem tribunal before Yellow and Blue Diamond themselves, defending Rose Quartz against the charge of having committed the most serious crime in gem civilization. The argument he tried to make, that Rose had been protecting Earth, that the war had been justified, went nowhere in the way he had hoped. But the trial produced something unexpected, evidence that the official story of Pink Diamond's shattering was wrong. That Rose Quartz, a Quartz-class soldier, could not have shattered a diamond with her own weapon. The physics did not work. Someone was lying, and the lie was at the center of everything. And then in an episode that remains one of the most precisely constructed narrative reveals in animated television, the truth came out. Through Pearl's memories. Through Pearl finally being allowed, by Steven's specific circumstances and the exact form of the question asked, to reach around the edges of the command she had been carrying for thousands of years. Rose Quartz was Pink Diamond. The ambient tone goes very quiet, almost nothing for a long breath. Think about what that meant for Steven. His mother, Rose Quartz, the legendary rebel leader, the gem who had given up her physical form to create him, was not who she had been presented as. She was not a rebel who had killed a diamond. She was the diamond. She had faked her own shattering. She had started a rebellion against her own colony. She had spent thousands of years living as someone she had invented. She had compelled the person closest to her to keep the secret for the entirety of that time. She had left Stephen a gemstone in his stomach that was not the gemstone of a court soldier. It was Pink Diamond's gem, the most powerful kind of gem in the known gem civilization. He was not the son of a rebel leader. He was, in the lineage of the gem world, the heir of a diamond, and the woman he had been carrying as a symbol and a mystery and a source of love and guilt in equal measure had been someone else entirely, someone far more complicated than the image he had been given, someone who had made choices across thousands of years that he was now standing in the consequences of, without any preparation, without anyone having found a way to tell him. He had spent his whole life being told he needed to be worthy of his mother's legacy. He had not been told that the legacy included lying to everyone she loved for thousands of years for reasons that mixed genuine feeling with a remarkable amount of self-protection. But Stephen did not collapse under this. He did something harder and more valuable. He kept going. He went to find the other diamonds. He went to White Diamond's ship, to the heart of the gem hierarchy, to confront the beings who had launched the corrupting light and ended the war and created the circumstance that had shaped everything. He went with Pearl and Garnet and Amethyst and Connie, and he went with a message that was not an accusation and not a surrender and not a demand. He went with the only thing he knew how to offer, the thing he had always had, his own self, whole and intact, and utterly refusing to be anyone else. Section 10. The Truth Beneath the Rose, Confronting Homeworld and White Diamond. Low, resonant ambient, steady and large, like standing in a very big room. White Diamond's ship was the largest structure Stephen had ever seen. He had grown up in a magical temple attached to a beach house. He had visited the moon. He had been inside gem structures on Homeworld. But White Diamond's ship was different in scale from all of those things, an entire moving homeworld, an architecture of such overwhelming whiteness and geometric precision that it felt less like a building and more like an argument. An argument about what perfection looked like, what it required, what it cost. White Diamond was at the center of everything. Not just spatially, not just in the hierarchy at the center in the sense that she was the source. The other diamonds had been, in one reading of the story, born from her in some way. Yellow and blue and pink were each a color extracted from the white light that contains all colors, aspects of a totality that had been divided into parts. Whether this was literally true or a useful metaphor was something the story left open, but the visual logic supported it. White was the prism, the source, the original. The others were her refractions. And White Diamond had spent, it is unclear exactly how long, in a state of fundamental unwillingness to acknowledge anything that she had not already decided was true. She controlled everything around her with a particular gem ability she had. She could project her consciousness into other gems and take them over entirely, removing their individual will and replacing it with her own. The gems in her direct service existed in a state of perfect performance, perfectly aligned with her expectations, never surprising her because she had, at some level, replaced their capacity for surprise with her own absolute certainty. She had done this to Pearl, not to the crystal gem Pearl, but to a Pearl who had originally been Pink Diamonds, a Pearl who was now in Yellow Diamond's court, who had a cracked gemstone and a fractured self, because the force of White's control had damaged her when Pink Diamond's refusal to comply had required White to use it to punish the Pearl who served her. This detail, like many in the story, is easy to miss and devastating when you do not miss it. White Diamond controlled everyone around her to prevent them from being wrong. Because wrongness, for White, was not a correctable condition. It was a fundamental failure of reality that she could not accommodate. She had not left her ship in a very long time, long enough that the other diamonds governed the day-to-day operations of the Empire without her involvement. Yellow ran the military. Blue ran the culture and the grief. White presided from an enormous distance. Her authority felt rather than exercised, her standards enforced by the simple fact of her existence. A subtle shift still large, but something warmer entering. Stephen did not plan a strategy for confronting White Diamond. This was characteristic of him. He was not a strategist by nature or by training. He was someone who showed up, with himself, and tried to reach the person on the other side of whatever was between them. What he had to offer White Diamond was something she had never received: contradiction. Not hostile contradiction, not the contradiction of defiance or attack, but the quiet, persistent, irresistible contradiction of a being who simply refused to be who White needed him to be. White needed him to be Pink Diamond. She had looked at Stephen, at the pink gemstone in his stomach, at the power he carried, at the way his presence affected the energy of the space around him, and she had decided he was pink in denial. A diamond in a human costume, refusing to acknowledge her true nature, playing a role that did not serve anyone. White's understanding of what had happened with Pink Diamond, with the rebellion, with all of it, was filtered through a belief she could not question, that everything that had gone wrong was a phase, a tantrum, a deviation that she could be corrected. She tried to take him over as she had taken over others. She projected her consciousness into him, expecting to find Pink Diamond underneath the human layering, expecting the familiar diamond energy to respond to her control. She found Stephen, not Pink, not a diamond in denial. A half-human boy with his mother's gem and his father's warmth, who was entirely himself, who was not Pink Diamond and had never been Pink Diamond, who was something genuinely new that White Diamond's entire conceptual framework had no category for. And he looked back at her, from inside the connection she had established, and he felt her. This was the other half of what Stephen carried that Pink Diamond had not: empathy. Direct, open, physically felt empathy. He could feel what the people around him were feeling in a way that went beyond observation. And what he felt inside White Diamond's consciousness, in the moment of her most complete expression of control, was something she had been hiding from everyone, including herself. She was terrified. Not of him, not of the rebellion or the crystal gems or any external threat. She was terrified of herself, of the possibility that she was wrong, of the possibility that the centuries and centuries of insisting on her own perfection had been a way of not looking at the thing underneath, that she did not know if she was good, that she had done things the corrupting light, Pink Diamond's treatment, the empire she had built on the suppression of individual will, that she had never allowed herself to see as what they were, and that if she stopped controlling, stopped insisting, stopped filling every space with her own certainty, she might have to face it. Stephen, feeling this, did not recoil. He was sad for her. He told her what he had told her throughout the confrontation, but this time from inside the connection. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be everything. You don't have to be the source. You can be wrong. You can have been wrong. The world continues, he told her with his whole self, with the pink light and the diamond energy and the human warmth and the specific quality of love that had been built into him by a mother who had given up everything to create something new. He told her that she did not have to keep being afraid of being less than perfect. And something shifted in White Diamond that had not shifted in a very, very long time. She blushed pink. This is the moment. If you have seen it, you know it. If you have not imagined the most monochromatic, controlled, glacially perfect being in existence, the one who has been presented in grayscale as an artistic statement about her refusal to allow complexity, suddenly flushed with a color she has been suppressing for longer than anyone has been counting. Pink. The color of the diamond she had dismissed and controlled and lost. She blushed, and the color came back to her, and she was, suddenly, in that moment, not a perfect being. She was something smaller and more complicated and much more real. She healed the corrupted gems. Not alone, it required all 4 diamond powers working in concert, Stephen standing in for Pink, all of them combining their energy into something that inverted the corrupting light into its opposite. The healing washed across the planet. Every gem who had been corrupted for 5,000 years, every creature who had been unable to find their way back to themselves for longer than human civilization, has been recording its own history, felt the healing reach them. The regeneration took time. The returning was gradual. But the gems in the temple basement began to glow, and the monsters who had been people began to become people again, and the long, terrible, helpless waiting that each of them had been doing inside their distorted forms was finally over. A warmth in the ambient, something that sounds like release. The world after that was not a simple place. Healing thousands of gems did not undo 5,000 years of their absence from their own lives. The crystal gems who had fought in the rebellion and been corrupted on the last day of the war emerged into a world that had moved on without them for millennia. The humans of Earth, including the ones in the zoo that Blue Diamond had built on a moon, had to navigate the knowledge of what had been done. in ways that the story could only begin to address before it moved on. The Diamond Authority was not dismantled overnight. Yellow and blue and white were not instantly, completely transformed by the events at the end of Season 5. They were changed, genuinely changed, moved by what had happened, by what Steven had done, by what they had learned about themselves in the course of it. But change of the kind that thousands of years of practice requires is not accomplished in a conversation or even a battle. It happens slowly, imperfectly, with backsliding and difficulty in the everyday continuation of a life that is trying to be something different from what it has been. The empire did not fall. The caste system did not immediately dissolve. Gem civilization continued, altered but intact, moving toward a different future at the speed at which enormous things actually change. Slowly, incompletely, with much still to be done. Era 3 had begun. That was the name for what came after not Era 1, which was the height of the Diamond Authority's colonial expansion, and not Era 2, the cautious, resource-conserving period after Pink Diamond's apparent shattering, but Era 3, the unknown future, the era for which there was no template, no precedent, no established protocol, the era that would have to be invented as it went. Steven stood at the beginning of that era, and he was not sure what it needed from him. Section 11. The movie Spinel, Forgotten Love, and the Weight of a Name. The ambient shifts something slightly more cinematic, still very quiet. 2 years after the healing. 2 years of Era 3. 2 years of a world trying to reorganize itself around new premises, that the Diamond Authority did not have the right to strip planets of their life for gem extraction. That fusions of different types were valid. That individual gems had the right to be more than their assignments. 2 years of the slow, difficult, imperfect work of that reorganization, while Steven lived on Earth in the house attached to the temple and tried to figure out who he was in a world that was no longer in active crisis. He gave an announcement, a broadcast sent out across the galaxy, reaching every corner of space where gem communication technology extended, which was many, many corners. He stood in front of a camera and he talked about the future, about the end of Homeworld's colonial practices, about Era 3, about what was possible now that the Diamond Authority was changing. He did not know that the broadcast would reach a garden on an asteroid that had not been visited in 6,000 years. He did not know, when he pressed the button and sent his message out into the universe, that there was a being in that garden who had been waiting perfectly still, frozen in a posture of waiting, unmoving for longer than human civilization had existed for someone to tell her that Pink Diamond was gone. He did not know about Spinel. And then Spinel arrived. She came from the sky in a burst of energy that precluded any gentle introduction. She came with a massive, terrible weapon, a biological injector, a device designed to inject a substance into a planet's core that would corrupt and kill all organic life, a needle the size of a building pushed deep into the earth like a syringe. She came in colors that had faded from their original brightness, her appearance worn in the way that something looks when it has been left in one position for too long. She came with a fighting style that was all rubber hose elasticity and physical comedy transformed into violence. The movements of a jester made weaponized, every pratfall and stretching limb turned toward destruction. She came furious. The fury was real and it was earned. 6,000 years of waiting. 6,000 years in a garden for someone who was not coming. The worst part, the part that required understanding Pink Diamond's departure completely, was that it was not cruelty. It was not malice. It was carelessness, which is in certain ways harder to carry than cruelty, because cruelty can be opposed and hatred can be directed, but carelessness has no face to direct your anger at. Pink Diamond had simply forgotten her, had gotten swept up in the newness and the excitement and the enormous life she was choosing for herself, and somewhere in the process of becoming rose quartz and leading a rebellion and falling in love with a planet, had stopped thinking about the small gem she had left standing in a garden. 6,000 years. Spinel had not moved because she did not know she was allowed to move. She had been told to stay and wait, and the completeness of her devotion, the total orientation of her being toward Pink Diamond, made even the possibility of independent movement feel like a betrayal of her purpose. If she moved, she was no longer waiting. If she was no longer waiting, she was no longer Spinel. So she stayed, and the garden changed around her. The carefully geometric crystal structures that had been built for Pink Diamond's comfort broke down gradually over centuries, their maintenance no longer attended to, the automatic systems that had kept them perfect eventually failing. The garden returned to a state of wildness which, for a gem garden, meant a different kind of wild than an earth meadow, but wild nonetheless. The flowers that grew there, through some process of geological seeding or design long forgotten, were forget-me-nots. Everywhere in the garden, forget-me-nots, the flower named for not being forgotten. Growing in the garden where someone had been completely, catastrophically forgotten. A quiet ache in the ambient still gentle, but carrying something difficult. Spinell's anger hit Stephen like all anger hits someone who did not commit the act being punished, with the particular disorientation of consequence arriving without direct causation. He was not Pink Diamond. He had never been Pink Diamond. He was the thing Pink Diamond had become. Instead of returning to the garden the life she had chosen, the child she had made possible at the cost of her own existence. He was the reason, in the most indirect possible sense, that Spinell had been left there. He could not apologize for what his mother had done. He could only be himself. In the specific way he was always most himself, open, warm, willing to sit with the hurt of someone who needed to hurt something without running from it. The film is not primarily a lore document. It is an emotional story about abandonment and recovery and what it means to be made for one person and then have to find yourself in the absence of that person. But it carries lore in its details. The forget-me-nots. The injector, which is itself a lore artifact, it tells us that Homeworld maintained the capability for this kind of planetary destruction even in the post-war period, that the weapons existed, that the knowledge existed. It tells us that Pink Diamond had access to these weapons and chose, in her growth toward rose quartz, to never use them, but that someone in grief and fury could find them and use them without her. Spinell, at her most destructive, was expressing what happens when the love that was designed into you has nowhere to go. She was built for companionship, for devotion, for the specific warmth of being wanted. When the person who wanted her stopped wanting her, stopped coming back, stopped sending word, stopped being present in any form that love had nowhere to direct itself except back, turned inward and curdled into rage and grief in equal parts. The resolution of the film Spinell finding a new place with the other diamonds, yellow and blue and white, taking her in with the enthusiastic warmth of people who needed something like play and found it is the right ending. Not a perfect ending, not a healing of what happened, but the beginning of something that might eventually resemble peace. The diamonds chose her freely, not as an assignment, not as a function. They genuinely, immediately, openly loved being around her, and the feeling was visible and unambiguous. For a being who had been forgotten, there is something right about being found by people who have never met her before, who have no history with her to complicate the welcome, who see her and simply respond, "Yes, stay, we want you here." She went with them. And somewhere in the ruins of the garden, the forget-me-nots kept growing. Whether Pink Diamond planted those flowers before she left, knowing they would outlast her return, knowing on some level that she would not come back, is one of those questions the story raises and does not answer. The flowers are simply there, in the background, vivid and named specifically for the act of remembering, in the garden of someone who was not remembered. It may have been a coincidence, a geological accident, seeds carried on some ancient current. It may have been the garden's maintenance system, cycling through a seed library that included that particular flower without anyone specifying that it was poignant to grow it there. It may have been something Rose arranged in a moment of private acknowledgement, a recognition, planted in stone and soil, that she knew she was not going back, that she knew she was leaving something behind. An apology in the form of flowers that grew without anyone to tend them in a place no one would visit for 6,000 years. We do not know. The story does not say. Some things are left where they are, in the background of a frame, unnamed, for you to feel what you feel about them without being told what to feel. Section 12. Steven Universe, Future. What comes after the ending? Ambient shifts again, still very slow, but there is something underneath it now, something unresolved. Most stories end when the central conflict is resolved. The battle is won or lost, the kingdom is saved or fallen. The question that drove everything is answered. The credits roll and the world of the story is sealed at that moment, preserved in the amber of conclusion. Steven Universe did not do this. It made a follow-up series called Steven Universe Future, a collection of 20 episodes set in the time after the healing, after the diamonds changed, after Spinel found a new home, after all the visible victories had been won. And it asked a question that most stories do not ask. What happens to the person who fought the war after the war is over? What does it cost to be the one who is responsible for everything? And what does it look like when someone who has been holding himself together for years, holding everyone else together, being the emotional center of every crisis, processing grief and betrayal and revelation after revelation, finally stops being able to hold? The answer was not simple. It was not clean. It was, in the way that true things about mental health are never clean, the story of a person encountering his own limits. The Ambien holds steady, present, and attentive. Steven Universe Future begins with Steven apparently fine. The world is changing. The crystal gems are there. His friends are there. Connie is there. He has won. The things he set out to do, protect the planet, heal the corrupted gems, change the Diamond Authority, he has done them. By any external measure, he has succeeded more completely than anyone had any right to expect. And he is not fine. This is the truth the series tells, with considerable care and genuine insight. Being the person who held everything together, being the one everyone leaned on, being the one who always had to be okay because other people needed him to be okay. This had a cost that victory did not automatically resolve. The cost was in his body, in his gem, in the way that years of crisis, years of being the emotional center of a group of immortal beings who had their own enormous traumas, years of absorbing and responding to and caring for everyone's pain, while not quite finding the space to care for his own, it lived somewhere. He began to manifest an unstable power. Pink light, hot and intense, arising from his gem in moments when his emotions peaked, particularly when the emotions were ones he had been trained by the circumstances of his whole life not to feel openly. Not the warmth and the love, which he had always been able to express, but the anger, the grief, the specific, legitimate fury of someone who had been carrying other people's stories from childhood without anyone quite helping him build the capacity for that, without anyone quite asking him how he was doing in a way that left real space for the answer to be, not good, actually. The pink formed Steven's body shifting into something larger, hotter, more powerful, infused with the raw diamond energy his gem contained, was frightening to him and to the people around him. It came when he could not hold the lid on anymore. It came when situations triggered old pain he had not processed, when encounters with people from his past brought up the specific variety of hurt that comes not from obvious cruelty, but from being loved imperfectly by people who were trying. He became, for a while, the thing he had spent his whole life being afraid of becoming, someone whose pain was visible in a way that affected others, someone who was not okay. The healing took time. It took a therapist, a human woman named Dr. Maheswaran, who did not know the specifics of gem civilization or diamond powers, or the history of a 5,000-year war, but who knew what grief looked like, and knew what it meant when someone had never been given permission to be angry, and knew how to sit with someone in their difficulty without trying to fix it immediately or move past it because it was uncomfortable. It took the crystal gems being able to see what they had, in their own grief and their own limitations, contributed to his burden. It took Greg finding the words to be honest about the ways his own loss and his own choices had put things on Steven that a child should not have been asked to carry. It took Connie steady, clear-eyed, genuinely loving Connie staying present even when present was difficult. It took Steven being able to say, eventually, that he was angry, that he was allowed to be angry, that loving his mother and being furious at her for what she had left him were both true at the same time, and that the anger was not a betrayal of the love. He had not been given language for that until this point. He had been given everything Rose Quartz could figure out how to leave her gem, her powers, her history, her legacy, the people who loved her now redirected toward him, and he had used all of it with extraordinary generosity and courage across his entire visible life. What he had not been given was permission to be a person inside all of that. A specific, individual, sometimes angry, sometimes hurt, sometimes not okay person who was allowed to have limits and struggles and feelings that were about himself rather than about everyone else. He got it. In the end, imperfectly and slowly and with help, he got there. Very soft settling, like something finding its level. He left Beach City. This is how the story ends, with Stephen, healed enough to go, getting into a van with Connie and driving away from everything he had known. The crystal gems were on the steps of the temple. Pearl, who had loved Rose for thousands of years and then learned to love Stephen for himself. Garnet, who was love-given form and had watched over this family across more years than anyone could conveniently count. Amethyst, who had come out of the ground too late for the war and too early for the peace, and had found her place in the middle of it all. Bismuth was there. Peridot and Lapis were there. The gems who had been enemies and become family. The off-colors, the misfits from Homeworld's tunnels, were there. Lars, who had died and come back pink, who had led a crew through space and come home changed, was there. And Stephen waved at all of them, and got in the van, and drove. Not away from them, not away from what they had built. He was not escaping. He was beginning finally, properly, as someone who had done the work of knowing himself well enough to have somewhere to be a life that was his. Not his mother's life, continued. Not Pink Diamond's legacy administered. Not the crystal gem's charge fulfilled. His life. Steven Universe's life, starting now. He was 17 years old. He was carrying a diamond's gemstone and a human heart and the history of 8,000 years in a body that had somehow held all of it and was still standing. He drove into the open road and the story let him go. Section 13. What 8,000 years really means. The ambient here is the softest it has been all night. Barely there, like the hum of a room you have been in long enough to forget you are hearing it. Let us come down slowly. We have been traveling a long time. 8,000 years. Or somewhere in that range. The story is not always precise, and the timelines at the edges blur in the way that very old things blur when you look at them from the wrong distance. But 8,000 years. More than enough time for every human civilization on Earth to rise and fall and leave its marks on the stone. More than enough time for languages to emerge and flourish and go silent. More than enough time for the tectonic plates under your feet to have shifted in measurable ways. And across that span of time, a single thread. A civilization made of living gemstone, spreading across a galaxy, extracting the life of worlds and crystallizing it into soldiers and workers and servants. All of it organized around 4 beings of extraordinary power, who sat at the top of a structure so old, no one inside it could remember the reasoning for its original construction. And inside that civilization, a single diamond who looked at a blue planet and felt something that did not fit. That is the seed from which all of this grew. One being's feeling. One moment of looking at a living world and being unable to destroy it. Everything else, the rebellion, the war, the faked shattering, the corrupting light, the 5,000 years of corrupted gems waiting in the earth, the centuries of Pearl's compelled silence, the small garden with the forget-me-nots, the jester who waited 6,000 years, the van and the guitar and the beach, and the half-human boy who was born from a diamond's love for what she could not bring herself to harm. All of it descended from that single moment of feeling. This is the other thing the story is about. Underneath the lore and the gem civilization and the war, it is about the fact that one person's decision to act on what she felt, however imperfectly and incompletely, changed everything. Not all at once, not cleanly, with enormous collateral damage and considerable personal harm to people who trusted her, but in the direction of something better, over a timescale that no human could have held in mind while it was happening. Rose Quartz Pink Diamond chose Earth, and all the life on it exists because she did. Slower still, almost imperceptibly slow, what happened to the specific people, the individual gems and humans whose lives ran through this story, is worth tracing, in the quiet way of an ending that respects the particularity of each one. Garnet continued to be Garnet. Ruby and Sapphire, who could have lived separately if they had wanted to, who could have said, after thousands of years of fusion, that they wanted to know what their individual lives were chose to stay fused. Garnet was not a compromise between 2 separate beings. Garnet was who they were most fully. She had chosen this, across 5,000 years, in every morning that the choice renewed itself. She would keep choosing it. Pearl had, by the end, been given back something that had been taken from her for thousands of years, the ability to speak. The compulsion that Rose had installed, that Pink Diamond had installed, using the authority of a diamond over a pearl in a moment that cost Pearl millennia of silence had, through the specific circumstances of the homeworld confrontation, been satisfied. Not reversed, not undone, but fulfilled. Pearl had found a way to tell the truth, and having told it, the compulsion lost its hold. She was, for the first time in longer than most civilizations have existed, able to speak completely. What she did with that freedom would take time. But she had time. Gems always have time. Amethyst had, in some ways, the cleanest resolution of anyone in the story. She had never been defined by the war that she had missed. She had never had to carry the weight of knowing what had been lost, because she had emerged after the loss was already settled fact. This was not easy. In its own way, she had spent years feeling like a mistake, like something left over and insufficient. But it was a different difficulty, and one she had already largely worked through by the end of the main series. She knew who she was. She was exactly herself. Connie went home, or rather, went to the next phase of her life she had colleges to apply to. A sword, a future that was going to involve gem-related work in some capacity, and a person she loved who was driving around in a van finding out who he was. She was going to be okay. More than okay. She was one of the most competent and grounded characters in the story, and the world of the show was better for having her in it. And the gems who had been corrupted, they came back. Slowly, in the days after the healing, in the months after that, they regenerated from their gemstones as the distortion that had been imposed on them cleared and their true forms reasserted themselves. They emerged confused, disoriented, missing decades and centuries and millennia into a world that had moved so far from what they knew that the adjustment must have been almost impossible to describe. But they were themselves again. They had names, they had faces. They could recognize people, could speak, could remember who they had been before the blast, or at least who they had been before the parts that the corruption had obscured. They were returned. Centipedal, the corrupted gem who had drawn frantic images of Rose and a ship and the crystal gem symbol in her half-restored moments, the gem who had recognized Steven as the shape of Rose and drawn her with arms open came back. What her name was, who she had been before the corruption, whether she and Rose had been close in the way those drawings implied these details the story does not provide. But she came back. She was herself again. Every bubbled gem in the temple basement came back. The basement that had been filling since the days after the war ended, 5,000 years of bubbled, corrupted gems stored in stasis, waiting for a cure that required a 4-diamond harmony that was not available until Steven managed to create it all of them. Every one returned. This is what the scale of 8,000 years amounts to, in the most personal and specific form it takes. Thousands of individual gems, each one a specific person with a specific history and a specific interior life, return to themselves after a span of imprisonment that is almost impossible to measure in human terms. And this, too, is Rose's legacy, more than the shield or the tears or the gemstone in Steven's stomach. The crystal gems she fought with, the gems she could not save from the corrupting light, the ones she stored and preserved because she could not heal them but could not leave them, they came home. Through Steven, through the connection he made with the diamonds, through the specific, improbable chain of events that began when Pink Diamond looked at Earth from orbit and felt something she could not name. They came home because she had been there to bubble them, because she had preserved them for the specific person who could eventually save them, because the story of her life, including its most difficult parts, had been leading here. The ambient is nearly nothing now, just the faintest presence, like the sound of your own breathing in a quiet room. There is a piece of music in Steven Universe that I want you to think about as we come to the end of this. It is called Here Comes a Thought. Garnet sings it, Garnet and Steven and Connie, together in an episode about anxiety, about the way worries spiral, about what it feels like when the mind turns against itself and the past and the future crowd out the present until there is almost no room to breathe. The song is gentle. It tells you, in the kindest possible terms, that the thoughts will come and go, that you are more than what the thoughts say about you, that the present moment is yours even when the past is pressing in from one side and the future from the other. And underneath the anxiety content, there is a second layer to the song. It is about Sapphire, whose future vision is a form of exactly this problem. She lives in time differently from other gems. She can see what is coming, and what is coming is always both true and subject to the disruption of unexpected love and unexpected choice. She has spent her existence in relationship with a future she can perceive but cannot always trust, because Ruby once did something unpredictable and the whole world changed. The song says, Even the thoughts about the future, even the visions, even the deep anxieties that feel like facts, they are thoughts. You are here. The moment is yours. That is, quietly, the lesson of 8,000 years. Not that history does not matter, not that the past is not real, not that what the Diamond Authority did or what Rose did or what the war cost can simply be set aside, but that the present is not determined by any of it. That the moment you are in this moment, right now, your breath slow, and the ambient quiet around you is your own. It belongs to you. Stephen drove away in a van because the present was his, finally. Not his mother's, not a diamond's, his. A long breath, the ambient settling into silence. 8,000 years came down, finally to this. A small planet in an unremarkable solar system, orbited by a single moon, covered in water and life, with a coast where a magical temple had stood for longer than anyone living could remember. Inside the temple, rooms shaped by the personalities of the people who lived in them. On the steps, a group of beings, some immortal, some mortal, some entirely new kinds of thing, who had found each other across war and time and loss and misunderstanding, and had made, out of all of that, something that resembled a family. Down the road, a big donut, a fry shop, a lighthouse, a town of ordinary human people living their particular ordinary lives, adjacent to the extraordinary, normalized by proximity into the kind of quiet acceptance that is maybe the most resilient human response to the impossible. You just go on. You adapt, you make room, and somewhere on a road that was not yet the road he would spend his life on, a 17-year-old boy with curly hair and a star on his shirt and a diamond's gemstone in his stomach, driving into whatever came next, with the window down and the wind moving through the van, and the summer air carrying the smell of an earth that was alive and intact and continuing, because thousands of years ago a diamond had looked at it and been unable to let it be destroyed. The van moves. The road opens ahead of it. The earth turns, as it has turned for billions of years, as it will turn for billions more. The gems keep going. Pearl and garnet and amethyst on the coast that is theirs, doing the quiet work of being alive in a world that is changing around them. And the story, the 8,000-year story, the diamond and rebellion story, the story of love made visible and identity chosen, and the slow, imperfect, ongoing project of being something better than what you were built to be does not end. It does not end because stories like this do not end. They continue, past the last frame, into the space beyond the edge of the map, into the futures of all the people they were about. They continue in the questions they leave open. They continue in the person who stays awake thinking about a chest in a lion's dimension, or a garden full of flowers named for not being forgotten, or the way White Diamond blushed pink when someone told her she did not have to be perfect. They continue in you if they have reached you, in whatever you carry away from this story into the night ahead of you. Final ambient, barely anything, just the warmth of continued presence. If you are still awake, I hope you found something useful in all of this. Something that made you feel, even slightly, less alone in the particular sadness of loving stories that end and leave things behind. 8,000 years of gem history, collapsed into a few hours of quiet narration, is not the whole of it, could never be the whole of it. There are details I have passed over, mysteries I have not addressed, individual episodes and moments that deserve their own attention, but the shape of it is here. The arc from the ancient homeworld to Era 3, from Pink Diamond in her garden to Stephen in his van. If you are asleep, I hope the story has kept you warm somewhere underneath the sleep. I hope the beach city ocean was audible at some level, and the temple was standing on its coast, and somewhere in the long, peaceful distance, a pink lion was on the front steps in the morning sun. Take good care of yourself. Be more than what you were made to be, or made to feel, or made to expect. That is what the show was asking. Underneath all the lore and the kindergartens and the 5,000-year wars, you are the answer. Not to anyone else's question, your own. If this kind of deep, slow lore content brings you peace, if falling asleep to 8,000 years of gem history is your kind of evening, then please like this video and subscribe. It tells the channel that this work matters, and it means more stories will find their way to you. New lore explorations, new sleep videos, new long dives into the worlds that live in our imaginations and will not quite let us go. Drop a comment too if you are so moved. Tell me which part of the story sat with you. Tell me if you have theories about the chest in Lion's Dimension, or about what Jasper did after the healing, or about whether the forget-me-nots were planted on purpose. Tell me whatever you want to tell me. The comment section is yours. Sleep well. The story is still there whenever you want to go back to it. Beach City is always on the coast. The Crystal Temple is lit against the sky. The ocean is constant and reliable. And somewhere on the steps, in the early morning before anyone else is awake, Lion is sitting in the sun, pink and enormous, and keeping his secrets. Good night.